quiet on the set.
Exactly. All right. Great. I'd like to call the SDCERS Board of Administration meeting of July 13, 2018 to order. First item on the agenda, well, do we have to approve minutes or do we go straight to?
No, but we do have a quorum.
We have a quorum. So then we'll go straight to non-agenda public comment. I have a speaker slip. So we'll start the meeting with public comment from Jocelyn Thomas. Ms. Thomas, you have 3 minutes to speak.
It's Joycelyn.
Say again?
Joycelyn.
Joycelyn, you have 3 minutes, please, Ms. Thomas.
Okay, SDCERS mission statement is to deliver accurate and timely benefits to its participants. With that in mind, I offer you a timeline for my problem. October 7, 2016, attended my divorce hearing. Both parties relinquished any interest in the other's retirement, medical, or other benefits. Prior to finalizing and signing the court documents, I made numerous attempts via the member portal to remove Edward Gomez from my beneficiary on my SDCERS account. Was finally advised by Lynette Bell I would need to speak with Cynthia Queen. I knew at this point the continuance was irrevocable. I just wanted to make sure Gomez would be deleted from the account and receive nothing. I called and left a message for Queen, but never received a call back. Instead, on January 19, 2017, I was sent an email from Queen stating, quote, "When you retired, you selected the maximum benefit married with a 50% continuance to your surviving spouse, Edward Gomez. If you divorce, bold, he is no longer eligible for the benefit. The continuance is irrevocable. You must remain married to the designated spouse from retirement to the date of your death for the continuance to be paid." Getting this email, I felt confident he would be removed, so I signed the marital settlement agreement, and my attorney sent it to the court on March 23, 2017. It was not until July 31, 2017, I received my certified copy with the judge's signature and gave SDCERS a copy. Within a month or two, I kept noticing Gomez still on my account. When pressed as to why, Queen now changed her reasoning and told me my attorney had screwed up the paperwork and now I needed a stipulation stating that if my death occurred before Gomez, a court document stating he would turn over the continuance to my daughter would be needed. My attorney did that, but it could have been done had Queen not given me erroneous advice prior to submitting paperwork to the court on March 23, 2017. With the stipulation now needed, submitted to the court and filed on May 24, 2018, the additional attorney cost was $795. $795 I would not have had to pay or incur had Queen, who I do not believe is an attorney with SDCERS, had not given me bad legal advice. On June 11, 2018, I met with Greg Rademacher. He admitted Queen made a mistake, but refused to pay the fees I incurred, stating, "Unless a judge orders me to do so, I will not. Might I remind you all, I'm a senior citizen on a fixed income. Risk Management will now receive a claim and a complaint from me regarding SDCERS. SDCERS needs to do the right thing and pay these fees. It's called accountability." Thank you.
Ms. Thomas, thank you for coming in and speaking your mind. With that, we will move to approval of consent agenda items A through D. Does anyone want, all right, we've got a motion from Charlie Hogquist, a second from Mike McBride. Does anyone want to pull any items for discussion?
Ready to vote?
We're ready to vote.
All votes are in.
All right, and that consent items were approved unanimously. By the way, I should have mentioned that Tanasi Priovalos is not in attendance. He is excused today. And it looks as though George Kenny, I believe, has had some car trouble on the way in, so he will be arriving a bit late. Next item is, well, we have no items pulled from consent, is that right?
Nope,
So we go straight to Audit Committee. Roberta Spoon.
All right, the Audit Committee met on Wednesday. We had no action items. We heard presentations from Linda Hurley, who's the partner for the public accounting firm, MGO. They presented their 2018 audit plan. It doesn't differ in any way of the areas that they'll focus on from last year's audit. We heard presentations from various staff members. Susan Youngflesh provided information regarding the new privacy policy. Johnny Tran presented information on the compliance program. And we also heard from Johnny Tran on changes to the conflict of interest policy. Sharon's or Siegel's response to Sharon's 2016 audit, or the 2016 actuarial valuation, was presented in the written form, but my recollection is that it was presented orally in September of 17. Is that correct? Yeah. So it was really just the written report. And other than that, we had status reports from legal, information, technology, and also from finance, who received the GFO award again for the 10th consecutive year, and 14 years in total, and 5 years since you've been here, right? Is that right? Is it 5 years? Correct. Well, congratulations. Those are difficult to receive, and I know when you receive them for 10 years in a row, it may sound like it's easy, but it isn't. It's very rare that an agency would receive that, so thank you very much. And today I'd like to introduce our new internal auditor, Sarah Dixon. Sarah has been on the job about 3 weeks, is that correct? And she comes to us from Sempra, and we were very, very fortunate that she accepted our offer. We're so happy to have her here. We met with Sarah yesterday after our meeting and discussed the internal audit plan and expectations for the future year. So welcome, welcome. Thank you. And that's it.
Thank you, Bobby. That brings us to business operations, and the first item of business is for Greg Rademacher to discuss the board rule on the confirmation of the board vice president.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to see everyone this morning. Our board policy requires a newly elected board president to select a vice president, and for the board to approve or confirm that selection at a public meeting such as this by majority vote. And so at this time, it would be appropriate for the newly elected board president to announce who he would like to select as vice president and to make a motion for the board to confirm that.
Well, I have thought long and hard about this, and I know I've received input from everyone on the board, and so the unanimous decision of the board is to renominate Carol Broad as board vice president.
Okay. Make it smooth.
At this point, I would move my fellow board members to approve that nomination, and I think we need a button, and I probably am the one to make the motion. Is a second required for this?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll need a second from another board member.
Yeah.
I got it.
Ready to vote?
Do I vote?
You may abstain or you may vote.
I think I'll abstain. Seems right.
All votes are in.
All right. That motion carries unanimously with, of course, the abstention of our newly elected board vice president. Now it's time for your speech.
I'll just briefly say thanks for your confidence, and I look forward to serving as vice president.
Great. Thank you very much for doing it, Carol. That brings us to sort of a status report item that I had requested from Greg, which is a report on the status of the Prop B litigation.
Certainly. Just a bit of a timeline. In June of 2012, the San Diego City voters approved Proposition B, and among other things, required the newly hired city employees, excluding the sworn police employees, to receive retirements from a DC plan rather than a DB plan similar to the one that is administered by SDCERS.
DC meaning defined contribution and...
Defined contribution. Thank you. Defined contribution plan rather than a defined benefit plan, similar to one that's administered by SDCERS. Following that, there was an action by 4 unions with the PER board, the Public Employees Relation Board, challenging that, based that the city had violated some meet and confer rules. In December 2015, the Public Employment Relations Board, PERB, ruled that the city should have negotiated the terms of Prop B. And in April of 2017, the Court of Appeals returned the case to the PERB with directions to dismiss the complaint. And in May of 2018, the California Supreme Court heard oral arguments and has until August 30th to publish its opinion.
Thank you, Greg. The opinion caused me to think that perhaps we should establish an ad hoc committee of the board simply to be on alert to review the potential consequences of the decision if it comes out adverse to the city, so that we are not flat-footed when it happens, that we have a press statement to make, that we have at least some idea of what the processes are that we should be considering. And for that purpose, I think I would, since we are all here and have this meeting, I think it may be appropriate for me to ask the board members to vote on whether they would favor the establishment of an ad hoc committee to oversee it. But I want Johnny's opinion on whether we can do that.
Sure, Val. Under the rules as adopted today as recommended by staff, you'll have the unilateral power to create an ad hoc committee without a formal vote of your board.
Thank you.
We do that so that way when the decision comes, should it be necessary between meetings, which only happens every other month, you can establish that.
Nevertheless, I think I would like at least an advisory vote from my fellow board members to know whether you agree with that approach or not. And then I think what I'd like to do is appoint probably a 3-person committee rather than enlarge it. And if there are members of the board who are interested, you could talk to me afterward if you want to be involved in that, or if you don't. And then I can, assuming that the board approves the ad hoc committee rule change that was before Business and Governance yesterday, or was that just approved on consent? No, that's still to come. So assuming that gets approved, I would have the ability to appoint the committee. All right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What would the ad hoc committee do differently that Greg and his staff would be doing differently?
The purpose would be for the ad hoc committee to work with Greg and his staff to do the same things they'd probably be doing anyway, but at least to have a board role in it so staff isn't on its own. This is a matter of substantial public import, and for example, if there's going to be a press release sent out, ordinarily what Greg and his staff would prepare it, and they might and probably would submit it to me to review. Carol might review it, but in this case, I think it would be better to have an ad hoc committee and have 1 or 2 other board members involved in setting eyes on it and saying, yeah, that's good to go. There may also be some need to at least prepare an outline of possible things that could happen so that we're not doing that on the fly. We already understand if there's a need to do anything in the first week or 2, we've already got a plan in place. So we'd just be working with Greg. All right? So I don't know if we can do a button on this, Cynthia, or whether I should just ask for a show of hands.
Show of hands will work. We'll record
All
it
right.
in a minute.
All right. Then what I'd like to do is ask fellow board members if you would raise your hand if you are in support of appointing the ad hoc committee for this purpose. All right, and that appears to be unanimous. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And as I say, after the meeting or at a break, please let me know if you have a particular interest in this. All right? Next item. We are on to fiduciary training, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Johnny Tran to introduce our fiduciary council.
Thank you, Val. I'd like to introduce Christopher Waddell, the board's fiduciary counsel, who will be doing his annual fiduciary training for you. Chris has tailored his presentation today to recognize the board's subsequent discussion about actuarial funding methodologies, so I believe this training will be immediately helpful to you. In 2014, the board appointed Chris as your fiduciary counsel. He is senior attorney at the law firm of Olson, Hagel, and Fishburne in Sacramento, where he leads his public retirement law practice group. Prior to that position, he was general counsel of SDCERS, the second largest pension fund in our country. Subsequent to that, he was general counsel of SDCERS, where he was instrumental in helping clean up some of the legal and ethical issues that happened in wake of the city's pension scandal. He is currently outside general counsel to the San Luis Obispo County Pension Trust, the CalSTRS Appeals Committee, the San Joaquin County Regional Transit Retirement. He's also in the Fiduciary Council pool for LA County and 3 sister city LA systems. Chris and I work closely on everything, any significant legal project that touches your fiduciary duties. I really respect his wisdom and experience, and I hope this presentation is helpful. Chris?
Wow. Thank you, Johnny. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back here. And I have a technical question. Do I push this to advance the slides, or what do I do here?
Could you put out the PowerPoint? Do you have that? You got that, Tabitha? Thank you.
Just how do I advance the slides? Okay. Got it. So in the time we've got this morning, we're going to start off with an overview and refresher of the duty of loyalty and duty of care that for board members who have sat through one or more of my prior presentations should sound at least somewhat familiar. We'll then move on to the 2 hats rule, which may be roughly characterized as what am I supposed to do when there's an issue before the board that will impact either the plan sponsor that appointed me or the member or general constituency that elected me. And sometimes, in addition, they're trying to tell me how I'm supposed to vote to protect their interests on the matter. We'll then conclude with a review of the 8 questions that we've talked about before that board members should ask themselves before casting on a vote on a particular decision before it. And as we'll see, those 8 questions are designed to capture the elements of both the duty of loyalty and the duty of care. Please feel free to interrupt me with questions at any time. This, I think, is a lot more meaningful for all of us if I'm not the one that's doing all the talking. So all of this language, all of these provisions are straight from the California Constitution. As you'll see, the duty of loyalty is called out in the California Constitution, Article 16, Section 17B. Duty of care, specifically mentioned in Article 16, Section 17C. There are also provisions in the Constitution relating to such things as the duty to diversify investments and the duty to provide for actuarial services in order to assure the competency of system assets. It's possible when you look at different legal provisions to identify as many as 5 or 6 different fiduciary duties. I think analytically and just for ease of keeping them in mind, they all fall into one of 2, either the duty of care or duty of loyalty. I know you probably can't read the words on the first image on the slide, which reads, I know we're supposed to be totally loyal, but to who? Which I think is sort of an interesting segue into the whole issue of duty of loyalty, which we'll be talking about in a minute. So there are a lot of words on this slide, which is the quote from the main duty of care provision in the California Constitution. I think it's helpful, again, to break it down a little bit and look at the various elements of the duty of care. Care, skill, diligence, and prudence. You get the idea that this is a fairly exacting standard. Under circumstances then prevailing, those of you who are old enough to remember Marvin Gaye, what's going on? Acting in a like capacity. Who are my and our peers? Prudent person. Well, prudence basically means care and thought for the future. Familiar with these matters. Now that's code for expertise, and we'll talk a little bit more about whether or not the standard in California is a prudent person or prudent expert standard and whether or not it even matters in a couple of minutes. And would use in the conduct of an enterprise of a like character and with like aims. And that is, basically calling you to look upon and identify and think about systems that are like yours, which SDCERS is like most other pension systems in many regards. It is unlike other California pension systems in others. California Constitution breaks out the duties to diversify and to provide for actuarial services as separate duties. Conceptually, again, I think it's easier to think about them as being part of the duty of care. Now, the duty to diversify language in the California Constitution comes straight to us from ERISA, which is the federal law governing fiduciary duties for private sector retirement plans. The duty to provide for actuarial services has a more interesting history. It comes to us because of 1991 legislation that gave then Governor Wilson the power to appoint the actuary for CalPERS. That legislation was challenged in court, but ultimately upheld by the Third District Court of Appeal in Sacramento. But the old adage of to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction is very applicable to the world of pension law. And right after the court issued its decision, CalPERS and some of its stakeholders qualified an initiative for the California ballot known as Proposition 162 in 1992 and got it passed. And that proposition, among many other things, added the language that created the duty to provide for actuarial services to eliminate the possibility of legislation giving that authority to someone else. So practically speaking, the duty of care is all about process and information. Follow a prudent process. Get the necessary information. Secure the necessary outside expert advice. Ask questions, etc. And we'll be talking about that, kind of reinforce all of this when we go through the CalPERS 8 questions, and specifically the questions that relate to the fulfillment of the duty of care. Any questions so far? So some people in my field make a big deal about whether or not trustees are subject to a prudent person or a prudent expert standard. Technically, as is the case with ERISA, public pension fund trustees in California are subject to a prudent expert standard. Why? Because of the magic words in the duty of care language in the Constitution that we discussed a few slides ago that is, quote, familiar with these matters, unquote. Now, does it matter whether or not there's a prudent expert or a prudent person standard in the Constitution? I think it's probably more likely than not a distinction without a difference. Under either standard, unless the board construct contemplates an all-expert board, the duty of care would otherwise, in either event, require the engagement of expert consultants, such as investment consultants, investment managers, actuaries, auditors, and yes, even lawyers. But it's not enough to simply hire experts. As board members, you have a duty to oversee them and ensure that proper mechanisms are in place to monitor and review their performance. That is it on the flyover of duty of care at this point in time. We're going to come back to it again in a little bit. But do you have any questions at this point in time about duty of care before we move to duty of loyalty? Not seeing any, so we're going to move on. Duty of loyalty is what I call the big kahuna of fiduciary duties. This language, again, on the slide is straight from the California Constitution. The touchstone of the duty of loyalty is in the bolded language at the end of the slide. I have a series of slides that I use in other presentations that discusses when we're not in a California jurisdiction, which of the two fiduciary duties is more important, the duty of care or duty of loyalty? Well, in California, because of Proposition 162, which added this language, there's no question about it. This board's duty to its participants and beneficiaries shall take precedence over any other duty, and that is the duty of loyalty. This quote you cannot avoid if you are going through a fiduciary training. I love the word punctilio, not to be confused with the word peccadillo. And I like the image, this image of Justice Cardozo, who rendered these words in 1928, kind of like looking over all of us as we try to sort out how to particularly deal with an issue involving fiduciary duty, and specifically how to fulfill the obligation to make the interests of members of beneficiaries and retirees primary in the decision-making process. And you are going to hear what's in the best interests of members, beneficiaries, and retirees almost ad nauseum in the rest of the presentation, but it's just really important to keep that in mind. So, as we've said, board members must place the interests of system participants over all other interests. There are a lot of no's here on this slide. Going back to philosophy for just a moment, Immanuel Kant divides duties into two categories, perfect and imperfect. Imperfect duties are ambiguous and open-ended and generally require you to do something. The duty of care, in that regard, is an example of what's called an imperfect duty. Negative duties are unambiguous and require you not to do something. So, looking at this slide, there are an awful lot of don'ts that refer to this negative type of duty. Don't self-deal. Don't engage in prohibited transactions, including those that favor the interests of the plan sponsor, unions, or a third party over the interests of the members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole. Where possible, don't favor the interests of one group of members and beneficiaries over another, and that's what's called the duty of impartiality. We're going to focus today on the second don't and what's called the two hats rule. Again, this language is straight from the Constitution. The first and third bullets, providing benefits to participants and their beneficiaries, and defraying reasonable expenses of administering the system, those sort of seem self-evident. But what's this about minimizing employer contributions? How does that fit in? And again, not for the benefit of the plan sponsor, employee organizations, or taxpayers. So what about this language that says minimize employer contributions? The bottom line is if you can't look at minimize, excuse me, start over again. You can't look at that language in the Constitution regarding minimization of employer contributions in the abstract or in isolation. You have to look at it as sort of an all else being equal test, i.e., if a board action gives precedence to the interests of the system's members, beneficiaries, and retirees, and also results in minimizing employer contributions, then it's okay. Conversely, if the decision to reduce employer contributions is not motivated primarily by what's in the best interests of system members, retirees, and beneficiaries, it's not okay. And we're going to talk specifically about a case that, more recent case that discusses or turns on that very issue a few slides from now. If you look at this language from the City of Sacramento case in the second bullet on the slide, that's really sort of the lead case on the minimization of employer contributions language, which is the base for what I've been saying. Val.
It seems to me, Chris, that one of the clearest conflicts between these two duties, if you could call it a conflict, is where we deal with setting the discount rate. Because obviously the lower we set the discount rate, the more we can de-risk the portfolio, which benefits the members, but the higher the employer contribution must be in order to maintain adequate assets to meet our obligations. And so when we set a discount rate, and we 2 years ago engaged in a reduction from 7 down to 6.5%, we're weighing those two duties in a sense. And it used to be, as I understand, that pension funds like ours would have had a lower rate of return and a much less risky portfolio, but over the last 50 years or so, that's changed to where it's more market-based. And so when we're evaluating the discount rate, we are, to some extent, between those two duties. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that you're between them, but the primary focus has got to be on what's in the best interests of the system members, beneficiaries, and retirees, which I think can be roughly translated into how can we best fund this system so that we ensure that the benefits are going to be there. It's interesting historically because if you go back when I started, before I was a pension lawyer, I was a labor and employment and finance lawyer for the state of California. And when I first started, this is 1983, CalPERS had a discount rate, assumed return rate of, I think, 8%, but that was in line with what bond returns were
Right.
at the time. And right around that time also, I think a few years after that, they amended the California Constitution to, in essence, open up the asset allocation process for all California public retirement systems to allow for market investments. Before, most systems had been exclusively at bonds. It sort of happened that over that time, with the investment shift, bond rates came down and pension systems moved more heavily into stocks, and that's kind of where we find ourselves today. But there's sort of an interesting history there as to how we got to that point. But absolutely, I think that if you look at not just you, every system in California is dealing with this issue and how to best manage the issue of investment returns and assumed returns and the like, and what assumptions and how those assumptions drive what the employer is having to pay in large part. And again, that is sort of, I don't want to say unique circumstance, but historically where we find ourselves is that over the last 10 years or so, really since more than that, since 2008, 2009, we've had this situation where there are very large unfunded liabilities, and a lot of this process is involved in just how to manage this unfunded liability in a way that ensures that the system is actuarially sound, but at the same time, you can have, it's not in anyone's interests, it's not in the members, retirees, or beneficiaries' best interests to have contribution rates that the employer can't pay. You need a solvent contributing employer as part of this process. So there is balancing in there, but that balancing needs to be motivated by what's in the best interest of system members.
Thanks, Chris.
So that was kind of long-winded, but that's, yes, Bill?
I think this is also very relevant to what we're talking about today. So the actuary is going to give us a schedule of unfunded liability and some of the things we can do with it. We have a decision to make as a board. If we did something like reduce the amortization level from, say, 15 years to 5 years, that has an impact on the city, just as when we did the mortality table study and the discount rate reduction. And so we have to balance a bit what is the implication to the city if we do something like that. However, we've got this large unfunded liability that keeps growing. So we have to deal with that. That's our responsibility here. The city can't, that's not the city's responsibility.
It's not, the city's responsibility is to provide payments to SDCERS as SDCERS determines what is actually required to ultimately ensure that the money is available to pay the promised benefits by the city. So that's number one. There are, hypothetically speaking, there are and I'm not an actuary. I don't play one on TV either. But you could come up with hypothetical examples of a payment schedule that would pay off an unfunded liability sooner, but would have effects on the city, which again would affect the system's members, retirees, and beneficiaries. The case law clearly establishes that a retirement system consider, for example, the possibility that if you're choosing between two possible solutions for funding, one of which the city can handle without, for example, doing layoffs or other things, and then the other example where the payments are so high that the city would have to lay off employees, as one example, then it's reasonable to choose the option, if it's otherwise prudent, that doesn't put the city in such a position that there'd be massive layoffs. Because again, the layoffs clearly affect retirement benefits of the system members, retirees, and beneficiaries. Does that help? Tom?
So I know historically we've had board members who sit on this board as well as, say, the POA. And the POA, of course, is the representative negotiation team for the police officers. The conflict that I see there would be when they're in the midst of negotiations and at the same time, say, we're looking at the discount rate, which is going to impact member contributions, et cetera. In the past, I know that there have been board members that have sat on both boards. Is that something that is generally frowned upon, or is there anything that can be overcome?
It's very common, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment with respect to the Hats rule. But it's actually a good lead-in for that. The short answer
See that?
is that
Excellent.
Very, very Tanasi-like.
You're getting really good toward the end of your term.
It's only taken 7 years.
the main thing, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more in a minute, is that it's very common to have someone to have those two roles, which we call two hats. And the important thing for you to remember is that when you're up where you are right now, your obligation is to focus exclusively on what's in the best interest of the members as a whole, not just SDPOA, but the broader SDCERS membership construct.
But if you feel you can't do that, then your remedy is to recuse yourself.
Correct. Correct.
Thank you.
Here we are at the two hats rule. How about that?
Wow.
So virtually every retirement system in California, I can't think of one that doesn't meet this criteria, has a mix of members that are elected by active or retired members, appointed by the plan sponsor, or sit ex officio by virtue of holding another public office, which is often elective.
Is that Almas there with all those hats?
I don't know that I've seen someone wearing quite that many hats, but I've seen ones that come close. It's not uncommon for elected members to also be elected union officials. It's not uncommon for appointed or ex officio members to have day jobs where they manage human resource or budget functions that are directly impacted by retirement system issues. The two hats rule, as I said a moment ago, says that all of this is okay as long as you're wearing your board member hat. You make decisions with a sole focus on what's in the best interests of system members, retirees, and beneficiaries. So I don't like to read slides generally, but I'm going to do some of that here. You really have to focus on what hat are you wearing at a given time. If you're wearing your non-fiduciary hat, you can make decisions in your day job that may not be the best interests of system members, beneficiaries, and retirees as a whole. Quick side story. Long time ago, when I was not a pension lawyer, but when I was an employment lawyer for the state of California, I was advising the then Director of Personnel Administration, who sat on the CalPERS board with respect to the pension changes at CalPERS, the proposed pension changes that ultimately were overturned by Proposition 162. During the litigation that I referenced of that matter before the Proposition 162 passed, I got a call one day from a gentleman named Joe Wyatt, and that name may not mean anything to most of you, but Joe was CalPERS's fiduciary counsel, and until his passing was really, the dean of fiduciary law in California. And Joe, who I greatly respect now, or respected when I became a pension lawyer, started really laid into me about how I and my then boss were violating our fiduciary duties by proposing the changes that went into the legislation that led to Proposition 162. And I think Joe had kind of forgotten the whole two hats thing when we had this discussion, because at that time, my boss, the Director of Personnel Administration, was very much involved in the legislation, in the legislation and development of the legislation, but he was not doing that as a CalPERS board member, which he was. he was doing that as the Director of Personnel Administration, which is entirely within his right. Now, it would get a little complicated to the extent that the proposition, that this legislation would become a subject of what CalPERS was going to do in terms of legal challenge. And, you know, my then boss recused himself from those discussions on the CalPERS board. Again, your job as the Director of Human Resources, for example, is different than your job as a pension trustee. And as long as you are doing the jobs separately and not being influenced one way or the other in that capacity, you're okay to act.
This sounds a lot like the Prop B argument in front of the California Supreme Court.
It's a little bit different. I could go on about that. It's a little bit different because the issue in Prop B, as most of you know, was whether or not the city was actually sponsoring through the mayor Proposition B. So that got into labor law issues that were sort of interesting to me as a former labor lawyer. So it's slightly different, but not completely different. Any other questions about that? So, bottom line on this, as I've said about 10 times already, and will continue to say, is that when you're on the dais, you need to focus exclusively on what's in the best interests of system members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole. So, what about planned funding? You can take into consideration factors that you reasonably and prudently conclude would affect the interests of the system members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole, including short-term cash flow, long-term funding requirements of the system, the plan sponsor's ability to meet its current and future obligations to the system, to the extent that there would be an impairment to the system's short-term cash flow and or long-term funding. And you can consider the interests of system members, active members, in keeping their jobs. And there's a quote from the Bant case, which is one of the lead cases in this area at the bottom of the slide, that basically says that if a member of the system loses their job to a layoff, it drastically affects their pension benefits. And as a result, you can consider that. Val?
I'm troubled by that because I read the words system members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole to exclude the interests of active members as a part.
I'm really glad you asked me that question because when I was thinking about this presentation and going back over it, I kind of struggled with that a little bit. My advice in the past has, and I think now the best advice, is to focus on the aspect that if there are job losses within the system as a whole, that can affect itself the funding of the system and create a negative impact, not just on active members, but on retirees and beneficiaries, potentially. The language in Bant, I think, supports an opposite conclusion, which is that job loss is enough for the active members is enough. And so I cannot completely harmonize those things. I think the safer view is to focus not just on job loss, but to focus on what job loss means for the ultimate security and finances of the system as a whole. I think that's the better interpretation, but I have to acknowledge that that interpretation is probably a little more narrower than just the plain language of the case law that I'm looking to on this. So where does that leave us? Again, I said Bant is a great example of this principle in action. What happened in Bant is that I think it was actually the San Diego County retirement system, the county did a pension obligation bond, and the question was whether or not the county retirement system should do an interim valuation to recognize the impact of the pension obligation bond proceeds on the funding of the system. And the board did that, and that action was challenged in court. And the court, as you'll see on this slide, said that the adoption of that interim valuation, which had the effect of reducing employer contributions, did not violate the duty of loyalty, even though it saved the employer money, because funding of the system was strengthened and the action resulted in the preservation of active member jobs. So Bant, again, supports the conclusion that if a byproduct of system action is preserving active member jobs, and then that is sufficient cause to say that the duty of loyalty is not violated.
Although here, I'm more satisfied with this because of the conjunctive "and" between strengthening the system as a whole and preserving jobs.
Correct.
Okay.
The second bullet should be self-evident by this point in time, which is that if an action by the system is not in the best interests of members, start over again. If an action is not in the best interests of the members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole, it's not okay, even if it also benefits a plan sponsor or active employees, or both. Now, this is when we go into a brief history lesson about what happened here almost 15 years ago now. The issues with SDCERS at that time still bear repeating. There was a near total overlap at the time between SDCERS board membership and the city HR and budget offices and union presidents in office at the time. The SDCERS board meetings, in the view of my view and the view of many, in essence became an extension of the collective bargaining process. And collective bargaining agreements were enacted, that increased benefits for active members and were contingent upon SDCERS actions reducing cities' contributions. Now, you think about that for a minute, and maybe with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, increasing benefits and decreasing contributions does not sound like a recipe for continued financial success. There was an ultimate deal in place that, again, increased benefits immediately and decreased funding immediately. And there really did not appear to many, if any, that there was significant consideration of either the short-term or long-term funding implications for the system. Funding ultimately dipped predictably and precipitously. There were federal and state criminal prosecutions, an SEC investigation, lives were essentially ruined, and the town I grew up in and I love became known for a time as Enron by the Sea. So that's just a quick history lesson about what happened. There are a number of changes, starting with change in the construct of the SDCERS board and other actions, hiring of a new actuary, the guy behind me, who set the system on a course to actuarial soundness again. But it's taken a long time to dig out of that. Any questions?
How do we make sure nobody ever forgets that 20 years from now?
Well, that's one reason. That's one reason why I talk about it here, and that's a very good question because I've thought about that. Enough time has passed, and it's a good thing, right? You don't want this system's done a lot of good in the last 15 years, following all of this. I think that there is a lot of stuff going on, a lot of debate and discussion about defined benefit plans generally, not just in California, but nationally. And for whatever reason, a lot of folks tend to draw assumptions from, or draw conclusions for whatever reason, to that benefit the point of view that they are trying to articulate based upon, and the common view, the attacks on defined benefit plans. All the situations are different, but they tend to get kind of blended together. There's sort of, I don't want to say an agenda, but that's one point of view that's out there. And so I think a lot of it just comes down to trying to remember a history, trying to look at each situation differently, and developing solutions that are tailored to those specific issues. So it's always a good thing, turning to the O'Neill case, when a court comes along and says the same thing you've been teaching in fiduciary training for several years. The O'Neill court involved some decisions made with respect to the system funding by the Stanislaus County Employees Retirement Association. And the ultimate issue boiled down to the 2 bullet points on this slide. The court said they could look at what happened and the system's decisions from 2 perspectives. They could either look at it from the perspective that if you that the system cut the county a break, which would not be okay, or that the system took action to prevent job losses to Stanislav members and the resulting negative impact on the system members and the system itself. The court said, well, we can't tell what motivated those two, what motivated this particular decision or these particular decisions by the board. So as a result, the court said, we're going to send this back to the trial court for a decision. Now, that case was just tried about a month ago. There is still no decision from the court. I've talked to individuals involved in the trial. There's really no prediction of where this is going to end up. But I think the fundamental principle that the court looked at in this case is still going to hold irrespective of what the decision is. Either the system did it because they were motivated to give the employer a break, which the court would say is not okay, or the court would say that the decision was motivated by what's in the best interest of system members, in which case it would be okay. So that's to be determined. And again, the bottom line is how are you going to answer this question with respect to duty of loyalty? Does my intended vote reflect what I feel to be the best interests of the system's members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole, without regard to the interests of any constituency or appointing power responsible for my position as a board member? Okay. Any more questions on duty of loyalty before we turn to the CalPERS 8 questions? So there's one thing that is going to happen time and time again at a board meeting. Board members are going to be voting on stuff. So as you vote, how can you be confident that your vote is consistent with your applicable fiduciary duties of loyalty and care? Some of you may remember years ago that Warren Buffett famously came up with a series of questions. This was back in the middle of all the financial restatement stuff that happened 15, 20 years ago. Came up with a series of questions that audit committee members should ask themselves, I'm sorry, not should ask themselves, but should ask their external auditor with respect to trying to ferret out any potential issues or concerns with respect to corporate financials. So CalPERS borrowed from that idea and decided that they wanted to come up with a series of questions in which board members could ask themselves when they're casting a vote to ensure that they are voting consistently with their own fiduciary duties. So, summarizing these questions very quickly. Do you have all the information necessary to make a decision? Have all the benefits and risks of a particular decision been analyzed? Have any viable alternatives been identified and analyzed? Are experts and staff in agreement? If not, is it okay or not okay? Have all questions been sufficiently addressed? If you answer those 5 questions in the affirmative, there's a really good chance that you followed a prudent process and fulfilled your duty of care. 3 more questions. Do I have any actual or potential conflicts of interest that relate to this decision I'm making? Is my intended vote in the best interests of system members, retirees, and beneficiaries as a whole, without regard to the interests of others besides those system members, beneficiaries, and retirees? And lastly, will the decision I'm making favor one group of system members, retirees, and beneficiaries over another? If you answer no, yes, and no to those questions, you're likely good to go under the duty of loyalty and the duty of impartiality, which is actually question number 8. And this, again, just to sum up, the duties of loyalty and care are a constant presence in all board discussions and decisions. The first 5 questions were designed to ensure fulfillment of the duty of care And the last 3 questions are designed to help ensure the board's duty of loyalty is fulfilled. And that is all I have, unless you have any other additional questions for me. Okay, got to chuckle out a couple people. That's good.
I have a question. So it seems to me that when you consider the interests of someone who is voting, who happens to be a member of the system, that it's really a conflict between current interests and future interests. Because if the vote has a current benefit at the expense of a future benefit, then that's a kind of a different way to measure the conflict of interest as current versus future.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There are lots of different kinds of conflicts of interest. And part of that question goes not to just kind of the fiduciary issue you raised, which I'll talk about momentarily, but also general conflicts of interest laws applicable to board members and decisions. You are subject as board members to the Political Reform Act. And that identifies a number of financial conflicts that exist because of ownership of stock or property or those kinds of things that tell you you can't vote even if you're voting for the right reason, if you will, or if your vote is motivated by the correct thing. I think what you're going to kind of harkens back to the 2 hats rule. You're, as board members, not all of you, but some of you have day jobs that involve receipt of benefits from SDCERS. You can't, as a board member, cast your vote in any way, shape, or form that's influenced by the fact that you're a benefited member of SDCERS. You have to focus exclusively on what's in the overall best interest of the system, and that's in that context.
And that would go for not only for the benefit, but the amount of the contribution might go up if you vote a certain way.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's that too.
Yes.
Ignore it.
Ignore everything but what's in the
On
system.
a personal basis,
Yes.
but consider it on how it impacts members.
Yes, absolutely.
Could I just follow up? Let's say you're okay on this, you're able to separate this personal consideration, but you say, as a class, my fellow employees will have to pay more. So as a class, they are not happy. But as a class, they're also going to be not happy 20 years from now when they retire if the system isn't robust enough to pay the benefits.
So that goes back again to one of the earlier slides, which is that no matter how you got into the position as an SDCERS board member, you're not representing a constituency. Even if you are elected by a particular group, for example, your obligation is not to vote on what's in the best interests of that group, but what's on the best interests of the system as a whole.
Chris, if a member finds him or herself in a position where there's a conflict, say for instance with a constituent group that elected that member, or based on a personal matter, or anything like that, and is really struggling with whether or not he or she can be truly independent and objective on a vote, what should the trustee do?
If they cannot settle down on what they truly believe is in the best interest of the system as a whole, they should recuse. Now that can get complicated, because it can get complicated, for example, if it creates a quorum issue or a failure. I mean, there's lots of different things where I apologize, but you need to pick up the phone and call a general counsel or fiduciary counsel and talk through those things. But the bottom line is you've got to be able to separate that. I've seen actually recusals happen more commonly in the situation of system funding issues. For example, there's been litigation over the years where I've seen the plan sponsor representative recuse themselves, where they're being the plan sponsor is being sued, and plan sponsor representative doesn't feel like he or she can really participate in a way that is consistent with their fiduciary duties. Because it's just such an, and I think a lot of times it's often done on an appearance of conflict basis, because people could look at the situation from the outside and say, why is this person voting on this? They shouldn't be voting. And that's a legitimate concern.
There's no negative connotation to recusal.
No, there's no negative connotation to recuse at all, and it's actually viewed as a positive. And the only limited exception is, what do you do when the recusal causes a failure of a quorum or that kind of thing? And that gets complicated.
Any further questions? Chris, I think your presentation gets better every time.
Thank you, Val. Appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, for your attention. Appreciate it.
All right. That brings us to Gene Kalwarski and Chiron team, discussion of actuarial funding and economic assumptions. Gene, this is the podium right up here. Just in case you've never,
I understand you have new cameras here to put more heat on the speaker, right? Before I begin, with me is Alice Alsberg, and you probably noticed there's a missing person here. David Holland, who joined us right out of school, decided to look at different opportunities, and he's no longer with Chiron. But we have since supplemented the staff with Eric Wang in the back and a few other folks, Mike Maley and Greg Reardon. And I think when we had a conference call with Greg Reardon and Greg Rademacher, we decided his name would be Gregorius. It was confusing. Gregorio, that's right.
We're sorry to not have David here. He's been a big help to us over the years, and appreciate all that he's done.
Thank you. One other item I'd like to put to bed. The Siegel audit was mentioned, and we never formally addressed the board with the audit findings, although we did write a letter back in January 2018. Just to summarize, Siegel agreed with our numbers. The differential was less than 1%. There were some stylistic issues that we differed on, but that always happens in any actuarial audit. All of our practices meet the actuarial standards of practice, and there was one audit item that we will modify going forward in the future. They pointed out that when we did our experience study, we did not comment on each and every economic or each and every assumption, particularly the wage assumption, and we'll make sure that we talk to every single assumption. Unless anybody has any questions, I'm going to move on to the economic assumptions. Again, we're not, this is a preview to a potential September meeting, and normally in the past we had come in September each year to review the economic assumptions in advance of the January valuation meeting, but I think the request was to also come in here in July, because the second part of this presentation, I think, is the key thing, which is the funding policies. So I'm going to get to the economic assumptions. There are 6 on page 3. There are 6 factors that we look at, and I'll talk briefly about the importance of each. First one is historical experience, but we probably pay very little attention to that because that's like driving your car with through the back view mirror. Future expectations are very important. Industry trends, what other plans are doing. It's always good to see that you're not an outlier. There are regulatory professional standards that we have to meet, actuarial standards of practice. Plan dynamics are important. By dynamics, I mean the funded status of the plan, and then the board itself, its risk preference and risk tolerance. I'm going to let Alice go through some of the early factors, and then I'll come back in later.
Great. So we'll be taking a look at the discount rate assumption and the wage inflation assumption. And this first chart shows us the historical discount rate assumption that's moved from 8% in 2007 down to the 6.5% that it is today. And the wage inflation assumption was at 4.25%, and it's now been at 3.05% for several years. In terms of historical experience on the investment experience, we see that the red line here shows where SDCERS' current assumption is, so that's at the 6.5%. And we see that the fluctuating annual returns, so that the actual market returns, they have a net dollar-weighted return of 9.1%.
Now that we've passed June 30, 18, do we have a June 30, 18 return? Not yet. But I'm assuming it's going to be probably higher than the assumed rate of return.
And looking at your investment consultants' expectations by quarter, the 2018 quarter return, their expectation was at 6.55%, which is right in line with the current discount rate assumption of 6.5%. And you see that SDCERS has kept step with the expectation, moving that discount rate down over the period.
The next chart shows a survey performed by the, I think it's NASRA, National Association of State Retirement Administrators, of 126 large plans. And if you look to the left-hand scale, it goes from 0 to 126, and the median is at the 63rd level, and that's, if you follow across, today, that would be plans that are between 7 and 7.5. Back in 2001, most of the plans were at 8%. So the trend is clear that you're losing discount rates at the top in the green of 8.5%. There was even some greater than 8.5%. They're gone today, and SDCERS has been going along with this trend. In particular, the next chart shows SDCERS compared to California systems. So there's a survey performed in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, and the gold star is SDCERS. And you are at the conservative end of these systems, but I think another way to look at it, you've been leading the pack of the plans, getting to more realistic assumptions. Chris Waddell mentioned how at one time 8% was easy to reach because we had bonds yielding 8%, but now with inflation so low, that's really what's triggered this need to de-risk. And I don't know if anybody has any questions on this particular slide.
Who's at 6?
Pardon?
Who is at 6?
What are the funds that are below the 6.5% level, if any?
The 6% plan is the City of Pasadena safety plan, which has been closed for a number of years.
Are there any open plans that are lower than ours that we know of?
I do not believe so.
Okay.
There's also regulatory and professional standards. None of the federal rules really apply. The second sub-bullet there, well-documented public plan failures. It's interesting. I mean, from the East Coast, where I come from, you hear constantly of the Illinois systems, New Jersey and Kentucky and Connecticut and Dallas and Houston have their issues. So my definition of public plan failures are plans that had to do drastic pension reform, cutting benefits and COLAs and the like. Chris Waddell correctly pointed out that the true meaning of public plan failures is insolvency, and that really hasn't happened in the public sector, but you will be hearing of plan insolvencies in the Taft-Hartley sector shortly. There's a massive fund called the Central State Teamsters Pension Fund that's scheduled to go insolvent by 2023.
Gene, I have
Yes.
a question on this. So you talked about Illinois, New Jersey, Kentucky, these other states that are in trouble. Is there any kind of a benchmark where if a funding ratio gets to a certain point, like let's say it goes down to 65% or 60%, where you begin to, where that triggers some people like ourselves, the board, to say we've got to do something before it just tips over and goes off the cliff?
There are triggers, and when we get to the modeling later, we'll show them in more detail, but it's not the funding ratio that's the trigger. The trigger is the level of contributions that you're contributing relative to the cost of the benefits being earned and interest on the unfunded. Think of it as a credit card debt. You have monthly charges, and then you have a finance charge on top of that if you haven't paid the full bill last month. If the amount of money you put in each month to the credit card is less than those two items, you know you're spiraling downhill. To the degree you're well above that level, it doesn't matter what your funding ratio is, you're putting in enough money. And when you do the modeling, there's one graphic there that shows that relationship.
So kind of as a closed-end fund, and we're not totally there, but what happens is you have fewer members and more members retiring, you're in the red sooner, and you need to make sure that you preserve your assets.
Yes.
So there's something left in the end.
Yes.
Gene, on the funding ratio issue, a lot of times I think members of the public believe that funding ratio is a critical statistic measuring the health of a public pension fund. And maybe I thought that before I came on this board, but I've gotten a lot of education since, and now I realize that funding ratios are not a critical statistic measuring the health of the system for the reasons you gave, and also because you can't compare a funding ratio from one fund to another without taking into account all of the data and statistics relating to that fund, because a fund can alter its funding ratio to the positive by making non-conservative assumptions, including its discount rate, which I see other funds doing, not intentionally, but I see they are less conservative, and therefore their funding ratio looks healthier than ours. And one of the reasons our funding ratio may not be as healthy as theirs is that we're actually better funded, and part of that is because of our assumptions.
Yes, if you were to take those 126 large plans, or even just the California plans, and put everybody at the 6.5% discount rate, your funded ratio would be in the, not just the upper quartile, probably the upper 10% of plans.
It would be nice to see that. Nice to
Marcel,
see that information out in public.
I think, Marcel, I gave you a model that allowed you to do that, right?
I do. I have so that's part of the presentation that I gave when we talked about funds that were funded 90% or better. That last appendix took those funds and made their discount rate match ours and showed that we went from towards the bottom of funding ratios toward the top. And that was only for those 8 that I looked at, but I can bring that back to the board and look at California plans.
Let's do that after we get the latest round of data so that it's an update from what you did before that includes this fiscal year.
Of course.
Yeah, and that database we sent you, I think, has the other plans in it, doesn't it?
It had a lot of plans in it. It didn't have all of the California plans.
So it had the 126.
Had the 126 in it, yes.
Well, you know, and also we have a plan in our system, the airport plan, right? 90% funded, right? And so how did that happen? The way that happened was their board made a decision that they weren't going to let it go less than 90%. So they kicked in. They kick in every time they have to kick in to keep it there. That's an interesting way to do it.
And I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You said that we are one of the best funded plans in the state.
Yes, if you put everybody on equal.
If everybody's on a level playing field and compared across all systems, we're one of the best funded plans in the state.
And is Chris still here? Chris mentioned that you were enrun by the sea. Can you come up with a better phrase? Where we are?
It was in the past.
No, but I mean, we need a new phrase now for San Diego.
Thank you, Gene.
I also mentioned up there professional issues. There was this financial economics debate that actuaries were having for decades, and to say that not only is 6.5 is even too high, we ought to be measuring these plans on a risk-free rates of return. And there may be some requirements in the future to actually disclose what the liabilities would be using risk-free rates. The Actuarial Standards Board had a blue ribbon panel that came out with pronouncements, and there's a brand new actuarial standard of practice. You might have gotten an alert from our firm recently, ASOP 51, talks about increased disclosure of risk in a pension fund. I've been a big critic of my own profession, where I see valuation reports simply show this year versus last year, and there's no evidence of risk. But you've seen, for all the years we've been here, we go beyond that, and we do stress testing and the like. That's going to become a actual standard of practice. It was not a common practice in the past.
Would a risk-free rate of return be something in the neighborhood of 2%?
Through 2 to 3, close to the insurance annuity rates. I don't believe it should be there, but I do think.
Just telling you what it is. I'd like to make a motion. No, I'm kidding.
Which hat are you wearing? And we mentioned the plan's funded status. You know, the more, it's ironic, but the greater the funded status of the plan, the greater the potential for investment volatility. I've always said a plan that is 1% funded ought to be putting everything into Las Vegas, because if they lose, they lost very little. And then there's the board's risk preference. Later on, when we get the funding policy, we'll play with the model and take it from there. I'll turn it back to Alice now to talk about inflation, and then we'll get into the funding policy.
All right, so looking at the inflation assumption, again, starting historically, we see the red bars show the U.S. inflation over this period shown compared to SDCERS current inflation assumption. So that's compared to the 3.05%. And the U.S. inflation over the last 30 years is at about 2.1%. So that gives a relative comparison to the 3.05% assumption, which is for the future expectations.
I recall on that slide, I began my career with those peak inflation years, and I recall advising clients to lock up their liabilities, and the answer they would give us is that I can put my money in a CD, earn that money, and still have my principal, so why lock it up? And in retrospect, that didn't work out for them.
So similar to what we saw on the discount rate for plans, here's what the inflation assumption looks like. This is a SDCERS study, and it shows 159 plans, what the average inflation assumption is. And the average is 3%, which is right in line where we are at the 305. And this is the 2016 study. The 2017 study was since released, and the inflation assumption there was 2.9%, so still right along the same lines.
Is that likely to change soon?
People have been saying for the longest time that we're going to be having rising interest rates. I would expect sometime, but how soon, I don't know. Some of you are in the investment community. Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I think it's good.
It seems like everything you hear.
Pressure on wages.
So here's another graphic to support the current inflation assumption. The left column show the economic forecasters versus the right column, the California plans. And the economic forecasters have the median at about 2.35%, whereas the California plans, it's right around 3.1%. So again, in line with SDCERS current assumption. And then here, there's a lot going on this table, but this is just to summarize what the wage inflation experience has been doing for SDCERS. We see it by plan sponsors over the city, the port, and the airport. The city, we know that there's been the salary freeze for the 6 years. They're now out of the freeze as of 7/1/2018. So they have a lower 10, 15-year average there on their wage. But the port and the airport more closely reflect the assumption that we have at the 305.
Alice?
Yes.
With the latest pay raises for the police over 5 years, 4 years, how's that going to impact their contributions, and when is that going to go into effect?
So, well, we did a study on that, but that'll be rolled into each year's experience.
Okay.
But
We have, what do we have, like 4 or 5 different tiers within that?
yes,
Right.
but as far as size of the numbers, I don't have that.
I don't
study.
have that off the.
It wasn't small, but
Yeah.
What wasn't small?
The impact that it would have, yeah.
Okay.
Given that you're going down to 6.5 for this valuation, and as Alice just showed, the inflation assumption is well justified, I don't believe you would be, we don't expect to be making any further recommendations for this upcoming valuation. So now it's turning to the funding policy, and we have a number of slides. This slide talks about why you need one for guidance, education, and protection. And then you've seen our famous tank that we've shown in the past. The funding policy really determines how much determines how much you turn that valve there, employer contribution valve. And probably the key chart is on page 19. And at this point, you also have a funding beliefs paper, which is very consistent with all the slides that follow on this deck. And it talks about these 4 elements. And I don't know at this time if you want to talk briefly about the funding beliefs paper.
So one of the things provided to you in your materials today is a funding beliefs that we had put together to give some more guidance to the board on overarching what are our funding beliefs. We have our board rule 2.110. That is the mechanics. That says what's your discount rate, what are your amortization periods. But this was to look more at the funding policy. And as Gene goes through his presentation, you're going to see these 4 things that we're looking at. You can't, there's not one answer that gets you all 4 of them. When you go towards, we really want to talk about benefit security, well, that's a different way of doing your funding than if you want to look at sustainable costs. So you're going to have to weigh these 4 items, and as we've talked about in the past, these 4 items are not necessarily equal, right? This chart shows that they're equal, but they're not necessarily equal. So you're going to need to look at those items and knowing to get benefit security, what do we have to change? To get stable and predictable costs, what do we have to change? Look at all of those components and determine what we think is the best way to go forward for SDCERS. So we're happy to answer any questions on this, and I anticipate after this discussion, there may be some tweaks and changes to this based on comments from all of you, but we wanted to start with a framework that you had to look at as we go forward in this discussion.
So this is a draft. You're going to make changes based on this discussion, and then eventually will this come back and we'll approve it at the board?
This would come back to the board, and then it would go in our board policies, similar to all the wonderful board policies you've been reviewing this calendar year.
That'll be the September meeting?
Correct, September meeting, unless you determine that you want to have more changes at the September meeting, and we can push it off. But right now, my intent would be to bring this back to you in September with any changes from this meeting today.
Okay, and what we have that follows pretty much is in that funding beliefs policy, and Alice is going to take you through what the current.
So just to do a quick recap of the current funding policy, here are the elements of that policy. So the discount rate is in there, the amortization periods. So depending on the source of the gain or loss, there's different years for amortizing those unfunded portions. So gains and losses under 15 years, benefit changes for the city, 5 years, assumption changes, that's the longest period, 30 years. Again, we hold to no negative amortization, so you're always at least paying interest on the UAL balance. And then the police portion of the plan is amortized over level % of pay, whereas the closed portion of the plan uses a level dollar amortization. The asset smoothing method, SDCERS uses a 25% asymptotic method versus a fixed period that you see in some other plans, but it's similar to a 4-year period smoothing. The funding method, entry age normal, so entry age normal tends to be the most conservative value of the actuarial liability. And then, as we're doing here today, and we'll do in September, is we do an annual review of the economic assumptions, and then a periodic review of the demographic assumptions. And all of this is encased in the funding policy. The port and the airport just have a couple of little differences. So the port and the airport, they only use level dollar. They don't have a closed portion of the plan that was
Level %.
Oh, excuse me, level %, thank you. And then their benefit changes would be amortized over 20 years rather than 5 years like the city. And then as Bill pointed out, the airport does have this additional policy internally to make additional contributions based on certain triggers and the funding ratios that triggered.
What's the rationale for the frequency with which you review the assumptions? There's annual for economic, but 5 years for demographic.
To do the demographic, you have to collect all the data, census data for the 5 years, and do a study. And demographic changes don't change rapidly each year. Economic is just, you're looking at in the economy, and you're looking at returns and and that's easy to review each year. You don't have to collect any additional data. So it used to be that the economic was done every 5 years as well, but I think it's a sounder practice to each year take a look at it because it doesn't take a lot of effort.
Following up on Almus's point, there may be times when we get new demographic data that may be relevant to us. For example, CalSTRS or CalPERS may do a study that may not hit our 5-year time period for review, but I think it would be important to know if you get data like that that you consider to be highly relevant to our demographic assumptions, we would know about it. You'd alert us to it, and we'd have the opportunity to make changes more rapidly.
Yes.
Well, and I'd also just ask about, you know, the economy also doesn't just change so dramatically year in, year out, any more or less than demographics do. So that's just
Well, the
something that
economy has more volatility than the demographics do. Demographics are slow trends. You want to see those trends over a period of time and not from year to year. Whereas in a given year, you could have the stock market swing wildly. But it's more of a case that it's easy to do. We might as well look at it each year, whereas the demographic analysis is much more comprehensive. And
I think maybe Almus's point might have been, though, is there a justification for looking at it any more frequently than annually on an economic basis, or is annual the right frequency?
for the economic,
Yeah.
I think annual is the right frequency. And it has led the board, because we do it annually, to get to its 6.5% sooner than otherwise would have been the case.
Right.
Okay, so again, focusing on the objectives, and as Marcel stated, that these objectives, they are competing. You can't have one without giving way to another. So this slide does a good job of just sort of pinpointing how each objective would move. So to maximize benefit security, we would want shorter amortization periods. Let's get that money into the account sooner. But if you want to maximize cost sustainability, on the other hand, that would tend towards longer periods for a smoother cost pattern. If you're trying to maintain stable and predictable costs, here you would want to look to make periodic adjustments to those amortization periods. And that's similar to what we did with the cliff and the 5-year layering. We saw that there was a way to maintain stable and predictable costs, and there was a periodic an adjustment that was made to achieve that objective. And then intergenerational equity, this one really is sort of the hardest one to capture by way of funding, but the goal is to avoid passing costs to future generations that were earned today.
I heard an interesting comment from someone in my firm on that topic. The person said to me, you know, the older I get, the more I think the younger people should pay for things.
So when we do switch over to the projections and we start, if you want to start discussion on the amortization periods, this is a good recap just to keep in mind, where did all of this unfunded come from the city? What were the sources of these components? And we see the largest one, that purplish lavender color, so the demographic assumptions, and then the black, the economic assumptions, those two together. So changing those assumptions, firming up the assumptions of the plan, choosing more reasonable estimates of the liabilities, added about $1 billion, over $1 billion to the liability, so to the unfunded.
But I will point out on that one that the absolute largest one relative to each category is the investment side.
It's still the investment.
The 754.
So another way to look at this is your statement that the unfunded liability continues to grow would not have been true if we didn't change assumptions in 2008 and 9 didn't happen.
Could you briefly explain, though, Gene, why, if we've had a historical rate of return in excess of our historical discount rate, we have a large component of investment-caused UAL increase?
Well, in the dark past of the system, when you had a return that exceeded the expected return, there was something called the waterfall, and benefits were enhanced. So there were significant benefit enhancements with the MP1, MP2, and the like that resulted in spending those excesses.
So when it says investment 754, the real definition of what investments is may be something else. It may be the topping off or the taking of the high parts of the
No,
investment return.
not in this chart.
Okay.
This is just 2007.
So that was
Okay, so is it then, the issue here is that since '07, our historical returns have been below par?
Yes.
Yes.
What
Okay,
slide was that?
so that's what the 754 is.
Yes.
So even though we have the sense that markets have been doing really well, on average since '07, our portfolio return, which is not all in the stock market, obviously includes fixed income and other things, has on average been below our expected rate of return.
When you read that the markets have been great since, the Great Recession, well, you lost so much there, and
Right.
maybe you got back to where you were back then, but you should have been earning 6.5 to 7% for that whole period.
Right.
Well, and the losses were in '08 and '09,
Yes.
which is part of this period.
Right, sure, that's true.
Yeah, so that original loss was over 800 and over 800 billion. So it has, these good returns have chipped away at that, but still leaving the.
So we're digging out of that $754 million hole is what we're doing, and we're still doing it.
Yeah, and so if the year ended with positive returns above the assumption, factor in the
They might, but I don't think it's going to be by very much if they,
and there's also the, asset smoothing, so depending on where the actuarial returns lie, that may or may not budge that,
So kind of the way,
it won't budge it.
the way it works is, if you've got $100 and you have a 50% loss, you're down to 50. You got to make 100%
right.
to make it up, right?
back.
So that's why it takes so long to make it up.
Right.
So these investment returns are pretty important in terms of, my belief is, in terms of how we set the amortization schedules, because it's the biggest item on the list. The others are more or less one-time deals. The demographic was a one-time deal, maybe every 5 years, but we made a big adjustment.
That was a
And
mortality.
reducing the discount rate to 6.5, we're not going to make big changes to that, I guess. But
well, not if inflation is rising and bond rates are rising, then we may not. So I understand where you're coming from.
And so taking a look at that UAL and now converting it to the amortization payment, here are the sources of the $255 million amortization payment of that unfunded. And what we have here, the largest portion, the $140 million, that's from the closing of the plan, that non-police, all of the unfunded that was from non-police liability was rolled into one. It was initially amortized at 15 years. The remaining period is about 11.8 years. Methods and assumptions get amortized over 30 years, and lumping those together, the remaining period is about 28.1. You see the experience, gains and losses are a very small portion, so that would be any of the demographic actual experience versus the expected. That's where the deviation there is.
But just to comment, in that gold bar, that consists of method assumption changes and experience gains and losses. They're mixed up in there because we collapsed all the bases.
right.
So now we're at the point where we're talking about, I guess, the essence of this presentation, the amortization periods. This is a projection scenario, assuming you're going to earn 6.5% each and every year, which you're not going to earn, but we need a baseline to start with. And the top graph shows your unfunded liability payment that Alice was just describing, and there'll be the layering is shown by the slide down scale, otherwise it would have been a steep drop. And the graph down below is the UAL, the unfunded liability, right down to the unfunded liability. And on the subsequent, that's current methods and assumptions, which Alice had described. The subsequent charts show, compare these two red lines to what if we change things. So on slide 27, if we just reset all the amortization basis to 5 years, which is something, Bill, I think you asked for, this is, the blue line is showing the UAL payment. Because you're doing over 5 years, that's why the peak is up there. And you see down below that the write down of the UAL is much more rapid. So this is an example of maximizing benefit security.
And Gene, this is a retroactive
Yes.
change, right? Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, my thinking is more prospectively, we reduce it down to 5 for the investment experience, but not retroactive.
And we'll get to the model, and we'll do that then. And the next slide is saying, what if we had 25 years for all the bases? And this is just to give you a bearing before we get to the model of the interaction of the amortization bases and the funded status of the plan. So this is minimizing employer contributions. And then slide 29, achieving stability. That's doing additional layering, which was a controversial topic here at some prior board meeting. And then intergenerational equity. If there's 9 remaining years for the actives and we reset everything to 9 years, this chart shows, again, a spike in the first 9 years, but there's just a question with this scenario in that a lot of the unfunded liabilities are attributable to people long gone and not the current active. So that's why I don't think this is an appropriate approach as well. But let's go to the simulation modeling. And so what we have here is just, I'm going to just remind, especially some of the newer board members, what we're doing here. This is a stress testing example, but on the left-hand side, there's a column of returns. We can modify year by year, or we can look at historical periods. We've added in a column called gains and losses. So, Bill, if you want to do gains and losses over 5 years, we can put in some loss percentages in there and see the impact. Then the next 2 columns are just, they're not inputs, they're just results. What's your actually determined contribution and your UAL. 2018 is fixed, so that's never going to change. Then the top graph is the gray bars are your liabilities, and your market value and actuarial value of assets are the lines. You can hardly see the 2 lines. That's because they're so close this year. And on the bottom chart, we've got the contributions, and the members are the dark green. If I can't quite see that with these bright lights, but it's a dark color. And the gold bar is the city contribution. And the things we could play with up above is, it says investment returns. We could look at right now baseline or change the returns manually by year, or we could look at historical. Historical is not turned on yet. You'll know that because on the left-hand side, I want you to just click historical once, Alice. To do historical, it'll turn those returns to that bluish color, consistent with years. So right now, we're looking at 1988 to, well, that's going through the booming market. So we'll come back to that later. Go back to baseline. Then what we can modify, you remember the layering, we could have layered longer, but right now I'm going to leave it at 5. The discount rate can be changed. The amortization type, right now we have a mix between level percent of pay or level dollar. We could turn everything back to level percent of pay or everything to level dollar, but probably the key things you may want to play with on the upper right, the assumptions. We could change lower the 30 years, gains and losses. We leave the past alone, that C stands for current, and we can change the future to 5 as Bill's suggesting. And we can reset the entire UAL for all the bases. So the first thing I want to do is, I'm guessing your return for June 30th, 18 is going to be somewhere in the 10-11% range?
No.
It's 7.9 for the third quarter, correct, Liza, from yesterday? So it's 7.9 through third quarter of this year.
So you have additional earnings for the fourth quarter, right?
Correct.
But you don't expect positive returns in the fourth quarter, or do?
Yes, I do.
So for the year, it might be close to 10, right? No. Nope, okay. So then just put 7.9. And now let's change future gains and losses to 5. And what I'm going to do is, let's take a market downturn in 2019. What do you want to?
Well, here's one thing you could do. You could go back and look at the experience over the last, just put those numbers in there over the last 10 years. I mean, that would be taking the historical experience
Okay.
on the gains and losses and just putting it in.
But before we do that, could we just change the 15 to the 5, look at that, and then do the historical perspective?
Okay, because we had a positive return, and now we're going to recognize the positive return over 5 years, the bottom chart shows the gold bars are lower than the baseline because we now are recognizing that return over a shorter period. If we change 2019 to minus 15%, I'm just doing that to look at. So you see the difference between the gold bars are spiking up to what, like 700 million?
700 million.
All we did is we changed the return for 2019.
We're not getting it on our screens is the disconnect.
Oh,
I hit return to meeting and came back, and now it's on my screen.
Oh, what? Go out of the meeting and back in?
so now we took a poor return, minus 15%, and we amortized it over 15 years. And that's compared to the baseline, which is the, change that 5 back to 30, Alice, so we can compare the two.
15.
There you go.
15, yeah. So if we had the bad market, that's what would happen. You'd go up to 570, and if we do it over 5 years, it goes up to 700.
Yeah, so here's my thinking on this. Just want to put it out. So in the last 10 years, we've had the largest subsidies to our economy ever in the history of the United States. So you got to take the three pieces: fiscal, monetary, and trade. The three things. You take fiscal policy in the last 10 years, we've added $1 trillion a year to the budget deficit, roughly. The deficit went from 10 trillion to 20 trillion. So the U.S. government's now in a kind of a debt. We're now listed with some of the countries with debt to GDP. We're in a debt mode. Second thing is, with monetary policies, we've held interest rates, that's the Federal Reserve Board, not the administration, at 0 to 1 to 2% in the same period of time, lowest ever in the history of the country. That's a big subsidy. People have been able to buy homes with mortgage rates of 3-4%. Never happened before. I bought my first home in 1970 with a 5.7% coupon assumed mortgage. Things have gone up. So anyway, that's the second thing. The third thing is trade policy. We had NAFTA in place, and we had a ping-pong politics with China, and so we've basically given away a lot and had big trade deficits. So looking forward 10 years, let's just make an assumption. The current administration is in there for 8 more years, or 6 more years, okay? The current administration's goals are to reduce the deficit, reduce the debt as much as possible. The monetary policy is to increase rates. They're doing that, and they're scheduled out there at 0.25% for the rest of the year. They continue to do it, and to deleverage. So they're now selling assets. They've got mortgage-backed securities and treasuries, deleverage. So that, again, is a negative factor on the economy. And the tariffs, the trade policy is to put tariffs on, to try and get the trade policy back to what it is. Okay, so I'm just throwing out a scenario that's very possible because we've got an administration in there that's doing this right now. So what could that possibly do? So that probably tells us that these investment gains and the market gains that we're getting now, it's going to be a challenge to do it. And I have to say that from our staff point of view and Aon Hewitt, they've done a magnificent job over the last 10 years in beating the benchmarks and doing everything possible to get these tremendous returns that we've gotten, and it's been great. But over this same period of time that we've done very well on the investment side, our unfunded liabilities gone from the time I've been here till now, from 2 billion to 2.8, 2.7 billion, somewhere in that. So we've had a 100% increase in the market and our unfunded liability. Now, I know the two big pieces of it are the mortality table and the discount rate. However, we have these experience gains. Now, looking at gains and losses.
The investment experience was
The investment
was a
experience,
loss.
yeah, it's a loss.
Yeah.
So looking at the model, in a way, we've kind of said, okay, we've adjusted for that with the 6.5% return, we've taken it down. However, we're still going to have gains and losses, right? And historically, we've had them and we are going to have them. So I believe that we are going to see some gains and losses. So let's just take a real hypothetical. Let's say that the market goes down 20% in the next 2 years, okay? So that takes the overall, probably takes our fund down substantially. Let's say our fund now goes to 6.5 or 7 billion. The unfunded liability hasn't changed. Now it's still 2.7. As a matter of fact, if we take a loss, gain loss, it increases. And so it may go up, to 3 billion. And what that does is it takes the funding ratio. The funding ratio gets really out of whack, down to like 60%. So just my experience tells me through 50 years of being in business and the markets and whatever, that the next 10 years could be very challenging for us from an investment point of view. And if we do run into any bumps in the roads, these gains, losses, we could be experiencing losses as we've experienced even with a 100% increase in the market, the 754 million we're showing there. It's more realistic we will have more losses in there.
That's what all the professionals in the investment.
But we're kind of not showing any here.
So Gene, let me stop everybody right now and ask you a question. Is this the time for the board to engage in the discussion? The point in your presentation where it would be good to invite?
We're done with our presentation.
Okay, in that case, what I'm going to do is suggest that we use the queue to weigh in after Bill's comments, and I appreciate those very much. But I think it's time for the discussion, and obviously we're not voting until September, but I would encourage a discussion now because we've got a lot to think about. So if people will use the queue who want to speak, we'll just take it in order. Okay? And I have Carol in the queue right now.
So Bill, I don't disagree with what you're saying about the risk going forward. Not to be repetitive, I think it is important to remember that a big chunk of what we have now in our unfunded liability is related to those assumption changes. And that I agree that those are, largely behind us. We could reduce the discount rate, I suppose, but, that kind of is what it is, and it's very conservative on our part. So, I hear what you're saying. I think we need to do some more modeling. I'm trying to make a connection between what you think the future looks like and a rationale for reducing the amortization on experience and having something that's a policy that's sustainable for us, even in a really austere environment. I think that could be really challenging.
Carol, do you want to work with Gene and Alice to just maybe propose a period of time or something? Because I do think it's a little bit difficult to work with just 1 or 2 years of assumption changes.
Well, we need to get the total back to 6.5, right?
We're at 6.5.
Okay.
But then use maybe use a historical period.
Yeah, is there well, I don't know what that would be. What would?
Let's start with the, go to 1951. Leave it to Beaver.
All right, so we're going to do the...
He's older than me, so...
We're going to do the Eisenhower good years now.
There, right. Now let's go, and this is with 15 years. Just now toggle the 15 to 5, back and forth. You'll see the impact.
Ready? Oops, wrong toggle.
Did you change it to 5?
Yeah, and now go forward.
Wait, I don't see anything changing.
Looking at these years.
It's small, but
It's small?
yeah,
Oh,
there
okay.
we go.
This is if everything goes well.
Right, now let's go to 1928.
Oh.
This is...
So you see the crash there in 2022, but yet things come back. This is on 5-year funding, so you see this, by the way, when she changes things, the scales change. So it's now the contribution is above $1 billion, because you have a 5-year, change that to 15, and the scale is. So basically, it's what we said earlier. The shorter the amortization period, the steeper the spiking.
Right.
But both approaches at the end of the day are bringing you to a period of full funding. But just go through this, cycle through the years, Alice, so we can look at all the different periods. So this is picking up returns over.
I feel like we had a scenario maybe in March or something that just had weakness in the next 5 years, and it totaled out to 6.5. I don't know if it was an actual period or a hypothetical period, but
Go to 1960 and then toggle forward. And we'll look.
We'll find that.
That's at 10.
There's an average at the bottom there. No, it's not picking it up. I guess it's the roaring. If we only looked at a 10-year or a 20-year outlook, maybe that would be more useful. Here we're looking at, what, 18, 28, 38, 40. Over 30 years. Do you think if it might be more useful to just look at 10 years?
Yeah, I do.
okay.
If you go back the last 10 years.
Can you
and
just
go
take
back 10 years
that
from
cell
that.
and make it be an average of 10 years
Last
of returns? Just focus on the left-hand.
The
She's
thing
just
is, the
going to.
last
Looking
10
at that
years
big of a
isn't
correction.
with 0% interest rates in the last 10 years is not really real.
Take 1990 to 2000.
No correction, no big correction in the last 10 years. You
Yeah,
miss it.
that's right.
You gotta go back 12 years.
Let's see, 18,
Well, the bad year- the-
27,
Bad years have rolled off.
13,
Don't count the first year.
What about the
Where am I
90s?
at? 13.
Okay, we're just going to look now for a 10-year average, and just look at the left-hand side of the chart, not. All right, go back to 1960.
60.
So there's what's that, 5.29?
In the first 10 years.
So the first 10 years of the projection is 5.229, and
I'm sorry, the 5 point, this is still a 30-year?
yeah, but the average of that first column at the very bottom, there's a 5.29. If you change the formula to only average the first 10 years of returns.
Okay, so that says the next 10 years is 5.29
Yes.
On average.
on average.
So the funding ratio does drop to like 70. Yeah, but you got some good returns in there as well. So if we did a 5-year amortization,
Liza, what are we going to get in the next 5 years? Can you just?
6.5%. You know,
Good
my,
answer.
my thought on this is that this is a good exercise to go through, and we've got a great model to do it with, but to do it in the meeting may not be real constructive. It might be better, Val, if you did like you did with the Prop B thing, appoint a committee or something between now and September to look at all these different options that could be presented to the board and say, well, you know, the committee that you would appoint might go through it and come back to the board and say, here's 3 or 4 viable options of what
That may
could
be
happen.
something the standing investment committee could do. But let me think about that, and I've been holding George off in the queue.
Thank you. First of all, I like the tool that you have here, appreciate it.
it's, you know, available to you online.
Yes, I appreciate that too. On page 26, you talk about 254.9 amortization payment. Does that include the most recent increase that the city voted for the fire and police, or not? The
Go back to the
254.9.
Are you-
It does not.
It does not. So,
includes
you know.
This thing here, the
I think in
256.
terms
Oh,
of
the
this
first one, yeah,
consideration,
that
we
first
oughta-
number.
I'd like to know,
Go to the
what is that
baseline.
number gonna look like roughly when you add the fire and police increase?
I think it's, you see that spike in 2019, is it? See the contribution go up? So Alice,
Where's
what's
it?
the
Right
increase?
here.
Yeah. What is,
So we're going from 379 to 409.
so that's
30.
30 million?
But that's based on a 30-year, right?
15 year.
15-year. Okay, so probably there's another, what, 30 million to be added to the 255? We can do that.
Maybe a little less than that, because some of that's just due to normal pay raises and the normal cost, but maybe.
Okay, fine. Oh, I'm sorry. And then I'm looking at page 29 versus page 30, where you show us a 15-year and a 9-year schedule. Forget it, I'm not worried about the Eisenhower or other backwards-looking scenarios yet. I'm just taking your scenario.
29 is not a 15-year scenario. 29 is saying that where we had a cliff where we got the layering going down, we would make that slide last 15 years. The comparison of 9 to 15 would be 30, and slide 25. That's got the 15 years in it.
So 30 is the 9-year, right?
Well, actually, on page 30, the 15 is the red line, and the 9 is the blue line.
Could you show it
Yep.
up there, because I don't have it in color here.
Hold on, page 30.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, so we see the red line is the baseline, right?
Yep.
And that averages over the next few years at what, about 270, 275, something like that?
Yes.
Right. And so, and this is this is a 9-year projection?
Yeah, but the problem is this is looking at resetting the old bases as well.
Right, so 9 years, so it looks like we're gonna have a bump up to 300 and, I don't know, what, 70 or?
That's if you reset the old bases as well.
Yeah, it's 100, if you do all of that, it's a $100 million increase in the UL payment.
Right. And then at a 9-year, am I wrong, but it looked like it was a reduction of payment, is that correct?
No, that's
Over the longer period.
after the 9 years, it's well
At
below.
2028, it
Just
plummets.
like 30.
Okay, there's a chart here on page 29. I'm in trouble because I can't see color
Yeah,
here.
slide 29 is an entirely different thing. It's not, it's taking those, you see where the red line on the top there is dropping down?
Yeah,
All 29 does is, let's stretch that out to a further period, over 15 years. It's not a 15-year amortization, it's 15 layers that we're gonna take 15 steps down to the low number instead of
Switch to
5
it.
steps.
There we go.
okay, well, it seems to me like, all right, so this, what am I looking at here? Is this a 15-year?
Imagine you were imagine you were, I don't know, 20 feet on the second floor and down to the ground, and you only had 5 steps to get to the ground. Each step would be larger coming down. If you had 20 steps, it would stretch it out further, and each step would be smaller. That's all this is doing. It's trying to,
All right, I don't like that analogy. I'm not following it. I can look at this graph here, and
but
it
it's-
looks like the city's payments are lower. Is that correct on this graph?
yes,
Okay, and it looks like they're maybe 30 million lower.
yes, and
For
then
the
it's
first
higher,
few years.
it's higher to the right.
And that's a 15-year projection, right? That's what it says on the top of your
It
chart.
says layering from 5 to 15 years.
It's
Right,
layering,
okay.
it's not
Layering.
It's not
amortization.
15-year amortization.
It's a different,
I got it. So one is
do you-
layering is just, and the other is an amortization.
Yes,
So I'm comparing apples and oranges.
yeah. That's why I said slide 30.
Okay, so let me tell you what I'm trying to get at. We're trying to digest $250 million, right?
Yep.
And that's against a 2.66 or 2.7 billion unfunded liability,
Yes,
right? And that's about 10%,
right.
roughly. Roughly speaking, it's about 10%, 9.5. So in fairness, from a very simplistic point of view, I think that the city's payments ought to go up about 9.5%. And what I'm struggling with is to figure out what layering would do that, or what
Well,
amortization
all right,
would do that. because one of them, I'm
I
not
think
in
we could do
favor
that
of.
here.
Let me finish, sir.
Okay.
Because one of them, I'm not in favor of if the city's payments go down.
Could you
And on
explain,
the other one, I'm not in favor of because the city's payments go up too much.
George, I'm hearing questions from other board members. Why do you think the city's payments should go up 9.5%? Could you maybe just explain that?
Oh, okay. From a simplistic point of view, we're trying to digest another 250 million. And we already have unfunded liabilities of 2.6 or 2.7 billion. Now, maybe my math is wrong, but that's about 9.5% that we're trying to digest
Well, I understand we're trying to.
relative to the unfunded liability.
Right, we're trying to digest we're trying to eliminate a $2.5 billion unfunded liability.
254
$1
million.
million no.
Payment.
That's the payment amount. It's a $2.5 billion gap that we're filling over time, but the payment is $250 million. That's not a.
All right.
Gene, what are your thoughts about what George is asking?
Well, I was going to say if we reset all the bases so that so the payments go up, like he says, 9.5% of go back.
To the no.
Well, based on the correction, I retract my calculation.
Yeah, I don't think it would get you there.
Let me just try a different tack. When we were here 3 months ago, I asked a simple question, which has complex solution, and that's based around the general principle that liabilities and assets ought to be matched.
Right.
And it was my belief that 30 years or 1 year amortization is not going to work. That there's some magic number in between where the assets and the liability flows match each other, and I guessed it might be at 11.72 years. And I was looking for hopefully a clear answer to that question today. I don't. Maybe here, but it's eluding me.
I think Alice had a bar chart, a pie chart, if you can go to that, that showed what the existing amortization periods are for the different layers. And if we were to look at the whole thing, my guess is we're somewhere around 15, because that methods and assumption up there is at 28.
It's 13 at level percent or 16 at level
Yeah, somewhere
percent.
between 13 and 16. I think that is an acceptable period.
Oh,
And-
you just take the weighted average?
Yes.
The weighted is 16 and the unweighted is
Well,
13?
It's somewhere in between, because part of it's level percentage pay, part is level dollars. So I would say it's in between. It's like 14 and a half.
Okay.
And I think that's an appropriate period based on your matching assets and liabilities. The only thing I would be considering is in the future, if you modify methods and assumptions, do you want to be as high as 30? Maybe we could drop that to 25 or 20. But from our vantage point, 15 is a nice balance between too much volatility or stretching costs out too far.
Well, but you,
But I've got Jeff in the queue, so I got to give him the next.
Thank you, Val. You done?
I'm done.
Okay.
For now.
So if I'm trying to understand what this exercise is,
Back to model.
going from 15 years to 5 years is to capture what we're anticipating a correction in the market, and so our unfunded liability isn't increases. Am I getting that correct, Gene?
I'm not sure I fully
I guess
understood.
in other words, what would be the benefit of changing it,
Shortening the amortization.
shortening amortization, thank you, from 15 years to 5 years?
It improves the funding ratio quicker than otherwise.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to make sure I understand that clearly before I get to my question. So we just implemented in the policy this asset smoothing for, the next till the plan closes, whatever year that was. Wouldn't changing these amortization years sort of contradict what the smoothing is supposed to correct, so we don't gain from the market gains, we don't get too many, or we can use those gains to offset the losses we have later? Isn't the asset smoothing also to keep the payments steady for
Yes, but
the
by
many years?
itself, it may not be enough. If we only used asset smoothing, that would imply an amortization period of 1. If we didn't have any, because you're saying the asset smoothing by itself should take care of stabilizing the contributions, but
Right.
it's not enough. And we could model it and show that you would have tremendous spikes.
That's the conflict between layering and amortization that we were talking about earlier.
Yep,
They're two different tools.
yes. And remember, one of those 4 balls is predictability and sustainability, or 2 of those balls are that, I think.
Right.
And so we're playing that balancing act, or we don't want to be too long or too short, but we're trying to keep the contributions from going so high so as to not create, well, it's already created a closing of the system, but any further benefit reductions.
So I'm next in the queue, and I want to follow up on this point, but I don't know if Jeff's done.
I am not done. So looking at the slides, and there was the 4 competing objectives, right? And then you have maximize benefit security, cost sustainability, stable predictable costs, and intergenerational equality, or equity. If we change this to the 5-year amortization, wouldn't that be all just focused on the first item of maximizing benefit security and foregoing the next 3 of cost sustainability, predictable costs, and intergenerational equity? Wouldn't the 5 years also just be completely ignoring that? And
Well, except maybe not the intergenerational equity, to the extent that the generation is partly passed and in the process of quickly passing that should be paying these bills.
Well, there's an argument to say that people that have already retired, why should just the current actors be responsible for all those retirees? You know,
But that's no better than passing it on to the people who weren't even born yet.
it's something in between the two. And that's where you're at 15.
All right.
did I get my answer question? Or I didn't know if I.
The answer was yes.
Yes, okay.
I disagree as to point 4. I agree as to point 2 and 3 is what I was telling you.
Oh, okay. All right, that's all. Thank you.
We've heard about using the amortization tool, and the way Bill explained it, I thought what he was suggesting was that we should use that to become more conservative in light of the risk that returns are going to be reduced in the future, or at least in the near future. And that triggered in my mind the question to you is that the right tool to use to address that risk? Because to me, I know we've lowered the discount rate, every year for the last 2 years and even before, and I know nobody wants to lower the discount rate, but we're not stuck with lowering it by 1/4 of a point or more every year. We could do something different than that, but my immediate thought is, well, it's the expected rate of return that we should be using to address a perception that the expected rate of return is going to be reduced, not the amortization schedules. Those are addressing different problems. And my second point, Gene, is I'm a little bit loath to reduce the discount rate right now for a different reason, which is I perceive bond interest rates are on the rise or will be, and that interest rates generally are on the rise or will be, which would allow for a better low-risk return than we've seen in the past. So I'm not sure whether we should be reducing our discount rate, but it seems to me that's the discussion we should be having if the problem we're addressing is the risk of lower returns. Can you address that?
I agree that if you're concerned about return expectations, that should be what you should be looking at, not amortization periods. But return expectations shouldn't be looked at in the short term. This is a long-term proposition, and if the next 5 or 6 years we expect low returns, what do we expect for a 20 or 30-year outlook? And those are the numbers that Aon Hewitt's giving us.
So my follow-up question is, okay, then if we want to address amortization, what is the issue we're trying to get at by reducing our amortization? And I think you've answered it, which is to improve the funding ratio.
Or cost volatility, to minimize cost volatility is what the amortization period focuses on.
All right.
And improve the funding ratio.
And I think we already talked about what's the significance of the funding ratio. It's a nice soundbite, but I'm not sure what it really means. But I do get the concept that the more money you already have in your system, the better off you are.
Yep.
All right. Karina's next.
Yes, I have a question on slide 10. I need help with this concept that the greater the funded status of the plan, the greater the potential for contribution volatility.
Okay.
So I'm thinking as your plan is getting more and more funded, you're de-risking your asset allocation, ideally, and that with a de-risk asset allocation, more conservative asset allocation, you would have less contribution volatility.
Well, my simple example is if you were 1% funded and the stock market dropped 50%, the impact on your funding requirements would be next to zero because you didn't lose much
Have your
money.
money yet.
But if you're at full funding and you lose 50%, there's an enormous impact on your funding, even with a de-risk portfolio. You can't.
Wouldn't be as exposed to the equity market in that case. I'm also assuming that if as your funded status is improving, you're de-risking your asset allocation, so you're not as exposed to that.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you have $1 of assets and $100 of liabilities, and you have it in 100% risky assets, and you lose 50%, you only lost 50 cents. And it doesn't take much to make that up. But if you were at $100 and you had a de-risk portfolio, so you lost 20%, you lost $20, and that's a bigger spike than making up the 50 cents.
All that's ignoring the other 99 cents or
Right.
whatever, and the safety of the city contributions in the future.
But you're making a good point, which you didn't, which hasn't been stated here. As you get to full funding, there ought to be de-risking, and you're describing in such a way that it's common knowledge. It's done. It's not necessarily done everywhere.
But like the Pasadena plan, that's at 6% because it is a closed plan.
Right.
All right. Well, we don't have anyone else in the queue. Does anyone want to jump in on this discussion, or shall we call it a discussion and take a break? Gene, do you want to come back after the break? You want to do it now?
I'd prefer to do it now if we
Okay.
finish up.
You want
because
to
Actually, I have one more question before we do that.
Jeff, I think
Oh,
Almas
sorry.
jumped in ahead, and then you.
I just had a question about what the expectations are for us to be making changes in any given year or every single year. I understand that we've made modifications to various factors and assumptions now several years going.
When it comes to the amortization policy, these were set in place in 2006 or 7 and largely have gone unchanged. And so what's causing us to discuss this today is simply that the funding beliefs, we want to put more teeth into the funding beliefs or funding policy. And so we want to reconfirm whether these are the appropriate amortization periods.
Okay. And I don't know if Greg, you have any perspective on that based on your experience.
Yes, one of the tenets of funding a plan is coming up with a very solid funding model, which I really believe SDCERS has currently. And it really should be based on long-term perspectives and long-term outlooks and not biased by short-term perspectives. So one way to do that is to periodically check in with the board and its expert, the plan actuary. Are we following trends appropriately? And there is a period, whether we do it annually or some other period, of which you should check in on those trends for demographic and economic. I think it's common for boards to do it on a less periodic basis. In my own personal experience, doing everything once every 3 years seemed to work well. I do know that SDCERS currently does the economic on every 5 years.
No, economic every year.
I'm sorry, non-economic, the demographic every 5 years, and the economic every year. I think that's within a reasonable range, whether we keep our current model of doing it that way or going to a less periodic basis on those, just to make sure that we keep focused on the long term rather than a short term.
And there was another reason for going from 3 to 5. We were on 3, the substantially equal requirement. Whenever you change assumptions, you have to then modify member contributions, and it was an attempt to not do that as frequently.
All right, so we have now 4 people in the queue. George, you're first.
You had your chance.
Well,
Yeah, you almost escaped, right. I just wanted to reinforce the statement that Bill made earlier, is that, our unfunded liabilities have gone up dramatically over the last few years since Bill's term, although we don't attribute that to Bill. So these charts that you've got here, which shows unfunded liability going down, I don't believe them because it's just opposite of what the history has happened. And so I would encourage us to have an informed decision when we eventually make one, where we have a scenario going forward that doesn't paint such a rosy picture for the unfunded liability going down. Because stuff happens, you have market breaks, you have other problems, and I just think it's too rosy a picture for all of these scenarios that you've shown where the unfunded liability goes down.
But we showed you 1928,
Understand?
and the unfunded liability went above $4 billion.
Well, I don't know if 28's the right one, but
Right.
I applaud you that we need something that's not so rosy.
I agree.
All right, thank you, George. Jeff?
Procedural, this is actually a question for you, Val. For procedural wise, do we need a motion to have the item heard in September? Or can we actually, do we have to have something official for that?
There will be a review of funding policies in September. It's already agendized. If a motion is made at that time to make a modification to funding policies, it can be voted on at that meeting. We don't need to make motions now for 2 months from now. That can be done at the time. And what I'm thinking is that rather than set up another ad hoc committee, because I don't want ad hoc committees to become the way business gets done. They're really for extraordinary circumstances. What I would be inclined to do is suggest that the investment committee consider what models they might want Gene to have, and that Carol work with Gene to make sure that we have provided not too many models, but at least a couple of models for discussion next time that will satisfy all elements of the board, that they've seen the model they want to see without having too many. And then we can have, we'll resume this discussion, and if anyone wants to make a motion to make a change to the policy, that the draft policy that's been presented here today, then we'll consider the motion.
Would it be improper to motion that we not consider this for September? The changing the amortization schedule down to 5
You mean you
years?
want to table it to a future meeting?
I don't talk about it at all. I want to end this.
In that case, your vote will be no.
Okay. I'm glad I asked.
I don't think that you could, I don't think there's such a thing as a cloture motion on this board where you can essentially shut down the discussion. But there might be. We could consult Robert's Rules of Order.
Point of order.
Yeah.
Point of order.
You should talk to Johnny, and if there is such a motion, you can make it either today or in the future. But I suspect the board's going to want to talk more and consider it.
I'm thinking this board, I'm not getting a warm reception, or I'm not feeling that this is everyone's on board with changing the amortization schedule.
I'm not predicting the outcome of the vote. I'm just saying that there are other board
Right.
members who I think are interested in having it come up. And it only takes 2 board members to put something on the agenda. So,
Thank you.
plus this is an automatic agenda issue every year at this time by board policy. All right, so thanks, Jeff. Bill, you're the last person in the queue, and then we're going to take a break. Sorry. Oh, and then there'll be Carol, and then we're going to take a break. And I think Gene wants to catch a plane.
Yeah. Oh, no.
So anybody who wants to get in before the break, this is your chance. Get in the queue now, because we got to eventually let Gene go. All right, Bill?
I think one thing we haven't discussed was this table that we got just recently that I think Greg put together.
Is this a question for Gene?
Well, we get this every year in our report, in our detailed actuarial report.
Yeah.
When we do
Okay.
the
I
evaluation.
think what is interesting is that 1.2 billion of the unfunded liability is 30-year amortizations. And currently, what's remaining on those is 21, 24, 25, 26, 28, 29, 30 years. I mean, these things go out for a long time. So we will be adding to these. I mean, the experience stuff will be adding to these at some point. And like George said, I think we are going to have an increase in the unfunded liability. Whatever happens to the investment side, there will be an increase to the unfunded liability at some point, because that's what experience tells us. 754 million is what's sitting there right now.
So Bill is untethering his argument from the investment returns. I appreciate that, Bill. Carol?
Well, just a point of clarification. So this is a great amount of detail, and it's really helpful if you're trying to understand this, but this is what's summarized on page 25 of the presentation, where they grouped it.
The chart, the pie chart.
They took all this and grouped it into the different components, and you can see what the remaining life is, and as Jean said, the average is
14 and a half.
13 to 16. Okay. Really, all I wanted to do was just clarify. I think the investment committee, I'm guessing, would be happy to put together some assumptions to help Jean do some modeling that we can really chew on next time. I'm just wondering procedurally how we do that. I mean, do we have to have a meeting, an interim meeting, or?
Consistent with the Brown Act, how do they get that information, talk about it, and get it to Jean? Or
Because-
does it just individual members get it to Jean?
You need a less than a quorum of the investment committee to talk to the actuary and do that. So you
Less
couldn't-
than a quorum.
Yeah,
And,
two.
That would be 2.
Yep, 2 or less.
all right. So
Would you guys trust 2? And which 2 would it be?
We could present some possible scenarios for the investment committee to consider without us there.
why don't you present them? The investment committee will meet on the Thursday before the board meeting, and the investment committee can pick 2 or 3 or,
And Leslie,
And
you know,
we can
we
do that
also
with
could do
1 day's
stochastic.
notice, in essence, just change
well,
it.
if Jean can do it, I don't know. That's what I'm asking.
Can I offer
think?
an alternative? I would offer that if the board members would like to forward to me their different scenarios, I could try to harmonize them and come up with some basic scenarios, and we can share them with Jean and do it that way.
Yeah, and then if it's a matter, maybe you have 5 and we pare it down to 3 at the meeting, or maybe we don't. But it's done at the investment committee meeting where there's a quorum and we're on the record. Okay?
I'm okay with that.
I think that works.
So you're saying any interested board member can send something
Any
to Greg?
interested board member can talk to Greg about what they'd like to see in the presentation materials at the investment committee meeting in September. The investment committee meeting will then determine which scenarios the board gets the following day for purposes of the discussion. And all board members can go online and play with the
If you have any trouble, you
model.
can call Alice.
We'll call Alice with all our
yeah, so
questions.
you can go on and look at how you want to do it and get your own ideas. So you don't need to wait for the investment committee meeting to see.
And that approach would be preferred as opposed to having an interim investment committee meeting for this special purpose.
That's up to the investment committee chair. If the investment committee chair wants to call an interim meeting, this doesn't preclude her from doing that.
I'm okay with what Greg's suggesting. Do you think it's really urgent that we have an interim meeting? Because I think that would work fine.
Jeff will not be going to that meeting, by the way.
I think it's just challenging to get everybody together.
I'm okay discussing it the day before.
This is just informational material, really.
Yeah,
Right.
I think it's a great idea.
Right.
Okay.
I'm okay with it.
All right.
That leaves, George, you're the last one in the queue. If it's a question for Gene, great, but he needs to catch a flight.
It's a question for Jean.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I was confused by layering versus amortization period. I wasn't reading the top chart. What I meant to compare was the picture on page 30, which is a reset amortization period for 9 years for all bases, versus which shows an increased payment of something like, I don't know, 300, or
Like 100
shows
million.
an increased payment of about 100. And then on page 28, it shows for 25 years for all bases, which shows a reduction in payment. Is that right?
Yes.
So what I'd like to know is what's the magic number where the payment doesn't change relative to the baseline?
Keeping things as they are.
There must be some amortization period between 9 and 25.
Oh, okay.
In that short term.
Right.
We will
For
make
the
sure that that
first-
is a scenario
for
that
the
we.
first
No,
few
let's-
You don't wanna
years,
see
you
it,
know,
yeah.
up until
Because there's a few things that-
2017.
We'll talk to you about.
And my guess is it's going to be between, 12 and 15 years, which is kind of your estimate based on that color diagram on page 25.
George is balancing his variance of his fiduciary duty right now.
Okay. I get what you're asking for.
Okay, so if you could
I could probably.
send us that chart.
We could do that in the next day or two. There's just one
Fine.
issue, a technical issue I want to talk to Alice about.
Okay, I like your model, thank you.
All right. Alice and Jean, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. We'll see you in September.
Okay.
Maybe that's the answer.
We're going to take a 5-minute break, well, maybe 10, come back at 5 after 11 to resume the agenda. We're back on the record, as they say, in court. So we're going to resume the meeting at this point. We've already covered the Prop B discussion, which is the next item, I think, on the on the agenda. Let me make sure I got this right. Yeah. And so now we're on to Disability Committee, and I would ask for a report from Charlie Hogquist, who chaired the meeting.
Good morning. Disability Committee met yesterday, and we had a very short meeting because we had 2 items. Staff has recommended the approval of an industrial disability application for Mr. Cortez, and also a non-industrial disability application, which the committee approved unanimously to go forward with. We also had a discussion. Do we have to do that one first and then go on to the second one?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do need to vote on.
Right, that's what I was going to say. So we'll just make, if somebody would like to make a motion to approve those requests?
Do you want Charlie to make the motion?
Charlie, I think you have to make the motion.
I have to make the motion? Okay, then I will make the motion. I'm learning how to do this.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
Okay, and the motion is passed 12-0. The other item that was up for discussion was, let's get this. A recommendation to do a reexamination of a disability retiree. We have a retiree who was retired and in years past has had a reexamination and met all the criteria for retirement. But recent news has come to us that this person has now accepted a position that has physical requirements that are the same as the job he had with the city. So we're going to request a reexamination for that purpose. And our committee voted unanimously to approve that request. Can I get a second? We have it. Thank you.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
Okay, and that's been approved 12-0. And lastly, just as a comment, we did receive a disability report from Sandra, and our applications are being processed timely. And I can tell you that when I compare back to 12 and 13 years ago, when 18 months to 3 years was a common time period, to see that the majority of them are between 3 and 6 months, I am very thankful for all the work staff is doing to keep those applications going forward. And with that, do we have any comments or questions from anybody else about our Disability Committee meeting? If not, Mr. Chair, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Charlie, excellent report. We now move to Business and Governance and everyone's favorite police officer, Tom Sullivan.
Thank you. I got to be acting chair in Tanasi's stead. Our meeting lasted 30 minutes. Our action items, we had 8 items. The first one was the approval for Microsoft Enterprise Licensing Agreement. The second was a Care Council contract, and the others were primarily contracting policies and policy reviews, et cetera. All 8 items were passed by 5-0 votes. So if there's any item anyone wants to pull for discussion? If not?
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that passes 12-0. And we went through the report on the overpayments of exceeding $10,000 or more, and Marcel provided us the overview of that. That the 3 overpayments have been all resolved. On the status reports, we were fortunate enough to have the discussions, and people were given the opportunity to speak about their hard work over the last 60 days in spite of Tanasi's objections.
Yay.
So I was glad to hear from the staff to know with hard work that they've been doing. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Tom, and I think Tanasi should be nervous about his job at this point.
There was a nice embracement. I felt the love after the meeting.
All right, that brings us to Investment Committee, and Carol.
Good morning. Investment Committee met yesterday for 3 hours, and I'm looking for a prize.
A parade.
Yeah, something like that. We're going to, we had all members present, and we're going to cover today 3 action items that we'll need to vote on, as well as a brief review of an interesting educational presentation that we received about an potential investment idea for our Opportunity Fund. But to start with, Jamie is going to talk to us about a real estate investment that was approved.
Thank you. Actually, before you begin, Jamie and Carol, I need to leave in about 10 minutes, but can I do a preemptive approval?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
You don't have to rush in case, just I don't want to look like I'm being rude and walking out on your session. So I'm just saying for the record that my approval has been given.
Okay, can you do that?
You can't really.
We'll have a quorum anyway.
We'll have a quorum anyway, right? Yeah, but thank you. Okay.
Great, thank you. You have in front of you staff and consultants' recommendation for a $20 million commitment to Almanac Realty Securities 8 for SDCERS real estate program. This recommendation is in compliance with the Real Estate Strategic Plan, which acts as the policy document for the real estate program, and the Annual Investment Plan, which is the planning document that includes the pacing model. This $20 million commitment fulfills the remaining allocation from the 2018 pacing model. Almanac Realty Securities 8 is a closed-end, non-core real estate debt fund focused on providing capital to experienced real estate operating companies that own real estate assets at the company or entity level. Rather than acquiring an individual property, Almanac will acquire a real estate company that owns underlying real estate, has a board of directors, and utilizes a business plan to achieve growth. This is referred to as entity-level investing, and it allows them better access to a diverse portfolio of real estate and to utilize the specialized skill sets of each company in which they invest. Almanac has a very long history in executing this strategy, and in fact, they were the first manager within this space. The fund is targeting a 12% net IRR over the fund's life. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, then we're ready to vote. I'll just say that this passed 5-0 in committee, and I feel like the committee was generally really enthusiastic about the quality of this manager, and the report prepared by Ann Hewitt was really quite solid. It's a very complicated concept, and we really got a great analysis from them. So I will make this motion.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
Okay, and that passed 12-0. Thank you, Jamie. Why don't we go to the next action item, which would be Anders talking about the global equity allocation and a related action item, which is retaining Dodge & Cox for a new global mandate.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again. As you may remember, at the May meeting, the board approved the reallocation of the public equity asset class from a U.S. equity focus to be more like the global equity markets, 50-50 instead of where we are now, 60-40. So as we discussed then, the reason for doing this would be the increased opportunity for excess returns by not constraining investment managers to narrow investment mandates. And so this action item would approve the plan to implement this reallocation. The plan was developed in collaboration with between the consultant and staff through several meetings and phone calls with global equity managers to find the best manager for SDCERS global equity portfolio. So we identified the 2 managers as our highest conviction ideas and developed several scenarios on how to best allocate between these 2 managers. After a thorough analysis,
we found that an equal weight would be the best option, with two goals in mind of having no one manager having a level of active risk contribution that would dominate the global equity asset class, as well as low correlations of excess returns between the global equity managers. So our recommendation is for SDCERS to implement this plan in 2 phases, with the first plan taking place today, and the second phase would be at the September board meeting. The first phase would be to approve Dodge & Cox to manage a global equity mandate, which would be about $145 million, or half of what we would be moving towards the global equity allocation. This will be sourced from the current Dodge & Cox U.S. equity allocation. And the second phase would be to approve Arrow Street to manage the remaining half of the additional global equity allocation, also $145 million roughly. This would also be sourced from the Dodge & Cox U.S. equity allocation. So by moving the Dodge & Cox U.S. equity strategy to a global mandate, SDCERS would incur a slight growth bias in the U.S. equity allocation. So to neutralize this, we would also move the Russell 1000 Growth Index Fund to a Russell 1000 Index Fund, which is more neutral in its style bias. So to recap, this item would approve the implementation phase of the new global equity allocation, as well as the Russell 1000 index change. The next item coming up on the agenda would be to approve Dodge & Cox to manage half of the additional global equity allocation. So with that, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Question?
Yeah, I had a question, and this may be for committee members or for Anders, but I really 2 questions. The first one is, do I understand this to be a shift of investments from U.S. equity markets to overseas non-U.S. equity markets?
It would be a global mandate. So global would be, so you would move 100% from U.S. equity to global. Global has about 50% U.S. exposure in it.
So it's a 25%
It would be
rather than a
50% of that move would be from U.S. to international companies.
So then my follow-up question is, why do we believe that the opportunity for excess returns, if you will, is greater in a global market fund rather than in a U.S. equities fund?
Good question. So the reason for that is, if you think about a U.S. equity manager, they're restricted to only investing in U.S. companies, right? So if they feel the U.S. stock market is overvalued, they're not allowed to go overseas and invest in markets that they may feel are more attractive. So that narrows their investment mandate a little bit. Global equity managers have the ability to say, you know what, we want to underweight the U.S. because we feel it's expensive. We feel that there are better opportunities overseas. So they would overweight overseas companies and underweight U.S. companies.
Are they mandated to share their allocations between U.S. and non-U.S. markets, or could they, in theory, if they thought it was prudent, be very highly weighted toward U.S. markets?
They could, yeah. They have certain constraints on their risk profiles that would say we can't be more than 20% overweight a certain country, 20% underweight a certain country, but that would be a manager-specific risk parameter.
So that it triggers for me a thought that maybe the investment committee's already addressed with Liza, and this may really not be an Anders question so much as it's a Liza question, but there has, Bill mentioned it earlier, there has been a lot of development in U.S. trade policy over the past 3 months that wasn't necessarily anticipated when we may have started thinking about our asset allocations. And I wondered if there's been any discussion in the investment committee about that, or any discussion among investment staff that maybe should be brought up with the board. And this may not be the right time and place, but it's in my mind.
Yeah, we really haven't had those discussions yet. I'm sure that's something that will come up. I'm guessing that it's going to be more country-specific and company-specific, and that we'll have to walk our way through that and figure out, depending on what we actually end up with, which can change from day to day, as you know, the policy we actually end up with, and how that's going to impact various industries, various companies, various countries.
Thank you.
And those trade policies would probably be more short-term, and an impact would probably be short-term as well.
Yeah, Val, it was one of the reasons I asked a while back for a country risk profile, because you can start to look at, so let's say 200 billion in tariffs on China, that's going to have an impact. So how much do we have invested in China, and what? Or you start look at some of the other nations, same thing.
And there, can be negative impacts on U.S. securities from trade policy as well.
No.
Okay.
We're going to win. We're going to win so big, you're going to get tired of winning.
Okay. Is there any further discussion? Then I'm going to make this motion.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
Did I vote? And that motion passes 12-0. So thank you for that, Anders. And now you can continue with the Dodge and Cox recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah, so Dodge and Cox was here yesterday. Our portfolio manager, Steve Casrell, was here, and the director of research, and the person was Brian Cameron. He's also a member of both the U.S. and the International Investment Policy Committee. So Dodge and Cox's investment process is based on fundamental bottom-up stock selection of companies that have an attractive valuation. What that means in English is basically that they analyze companies based on financial statements, talk to management and other stakeholders to come up with a fair price for the stock that they're interested in. So each stock requires the approval of the Investment Policy Committee before it can be added to the portfolio, which ensures a robust due diligence process of new ideas. Dodge & Cox also has a proprietary risk model that measures risk on portfolio and sector level, and this model reviews intentional and unintentional risk exposures, and the output is used at the Investment Policy Committee to make portfolio construction decisions. So the way the global equity allocation for Dodge & Cox will be set up is a little bit different. So SDCERS' current fee arrangement with Dodge & Cox's U.S. equity strategy is very favorable and no longer available to new clients. So to be able to keep this fee arrangement, the plan is to implement the global equity strategy by adding Dodge & Cox's international equity strategy to the current U.S. equity strategy, instead of closing the U.S. equity account and investing in a new global equity strategy. This would have fee savings of somewhere around $300,000 a year by doing this. And as a byproduct, SDCERS has used the U.S. equity allocation of Dodge & Cox since 2003 with good results.
Questions? Okay, then we'll have a vote. This did pass the committee 5-0, and I think we were impressed with the diligence and sincerity of these guys. They really are very dedicated to what they do, and they've been great performers. Time to vote.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that passes 12-0. And now Jeffrey can leave. Bye. Enjoy your day. Okay, thanks, Anders. Okay, the final presentation we're going to have regarding the committee is Liza's going to make some comments about the educational presentation on alt-risk premia and managed future strategies. And this is not an action item.
Good morning. So yesterday, we had a discussion about managed futures and alternative risk premia strategies at a very high level, and these two ideas are being contemplated possibly for inclusion in the Opportunity Fund. And both of these strategies, the reason we're looking at them is they provide diversification in the portfolio from traditional asset classes like stocks and bonds, and they can also offer some downside protection because they tend to do well in times of equity market stress. So the first strategy we looked at is called managed futures, and basically you're investing in futures contracts in global equities, fixed income, commodities, and currencies via the use of futures contracts, and you can be long or short. And the main driver of these returns is called a trend-following strategy. So there's a body of evidence out there that suggests that trends persist over various periods of time, and you can take advantage of that by, say, buying a futures contract on oil today at $70 a barrel, and if the oil price is going up, you can sell that at a future point in time for a profit. And so you would be long that futures contract. Vice versa, if you thought the trend was to go down, you would be short that futures contract. So the reason we're looking at this is basically you can take advantage of trends or momentum in the marketplace. It adds diversification to the portfolio because it has a very low correlation to stocks and bonds, and it tends to do well in times of equity market stress. The second, and managed futures strategies have been around for about 20 years, so they have a pretty long track record. Alternative risk premium strategies only have about a 2 to 3 year track record, and they're similar to managed futures because they're using futures contracts. But in addition to that trend following strategy that managed futures uses, they also look at other strategies that can exploit different anomalies in the market. Things like value. So you're buying cheap assets, you're selling expensive assets. Carry, which refers to interest rates. So you're buying higher yielding assets, you're selling lower yielding assets. And it can include other things like merger arbitrage. Again, why this strategy? It adds diversification to the portfolio. It has a low to zero correlation to stocks and bonds. Both strategies are very liquid. It's an alternative source of return, and again, can offer some downside protection. And that's one of the things that we've talked about at the investment committee, that, you know, we're 9 years in this bull market. At some point, we're going to have a correction, and these kind of strategies can give you some sort of downside protection in that environment. So the first phase was yesterday just having an educational presentation. The second phase, which will happen in September, is to do a much deeper dive into these different strategies to see how they fit in the portfolio, what might be the best implementation in terms of the size of an allocation, what types of managers would we want to look at, and then looking at the impact on the portfolio in terms of some metrics like tracking error, potential return, standard deviation, and things like that. So that's the next phase that will happen in September. If the committee is still interested, then we would pursue adding additional managers. So right now it's just at the idea stage, and we have to do some more analysis.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments for Liza? Okay, thanks. So the balance of the committee were performance reports. We had a brief presentation from Stepstone. John Coelho was here. The staff presented GCM Grosvenor, Ann Hewitt, or Ann Townsend, Aon and Ann Townsend presented their reports. And I'll just say briefly that in terms of total performance, as I think was mentioned earlier, our return through 3 quarters through March 31st of the fiscal year was 7.9%, which is 1.1% over the policy index. So we had very strong absolute and benchmark relative performance, as well as good performance versus peers. The major contributors to the return were real estate, private equity, and infrastructure, which continue to really do exceptionally well. But I think it's also worth noting that active managers in the liquid asset classes also sort of have moved a bit to the upside, and we're getting more contribution from active management than we have in the recent past. So that's great news as well. And the portfolio has outperformed in all historical periods, 1, 3, 5, 10, and since inception. So good performance.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So Gene seemed to think that a 10 or 11 or 12% performance was going to be reported. I mean, he sort of had this presumption of that. What could somebody explain what's going on?
Well, let me give you a little color.
Where you got that?
Basically, April and May, we were flat. 1 month was up, 1 was down. So we got no additional return in public markets. We had a little bit of a positive return in public markets in June. That's just based on index returns, we don't have any of our actual active manager returns. So it could be a little bit better than that. And then we don't have the final quarter of private market returns yet. So that should be additive as well. But we were thinking a little, We were at 7.9 through March. It's going to be, I'm thinking, close to that, somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay.
No, it's not going to be 10.
Are other public sector funds seeing much higher returns, or is that?
CalPERS just reported 8.6.
Okay.
I don't know. I think they might report gross.
Thanks.
Okay, that concludes my report.
All right. That takes us to training and Johnny Tran.
Thanks, Val. We have 3 training requests. CJ, if you could bring those up. One for Val Hoy to attend a conference, another for Carol, and one for Ed Katroser. Ed Katroser is a former board member and current audit committee member. Your education policy promotes audit committee members to attend conferences. They just rarely do, but Ed is allowed to do so here. Any questions? Otherwise, I'd like a motion.
Ready to vote. All votes are in.
All right. So that carried 11-0. Johnny, anything further on training? Is that it?
No.
All right. Then that leads us, I think, to questions and comments from staff. That we're going to have a closed session after, but at this point, any questions or comments from trustees or staff? Nope. Seeing none. That brings us to non-docket items. I don't believe there are any non-docket items, and so we will adjourn into closed session. Thank you, everyone. Between now and the commencement of closed session, I believe there might be lunch in the back room. Is it here?
Yeah.
All right,
The lunch
so
is here.
you can
says left to right. Did you get the gavel yet? This guy's Frank.
Not yet, he's gonna come back in and then.
Did,
No, they're the last two mentioned.
You give him the heads up.
I'm sorry, I
what about David, the videographer? Is he in there?
It's funny because they're both the same.
Maybe that's why one guy's called Scotchy.
Yeah. That's funny.
Okay.
You're famous.
Yeah, that was me before I was born.
We are.
That
You
was
got the thumbs up.
50 years before I was born.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but every day I walk by that banner, I'm like,
microphone?
Back in session after the board met in closed session to discuss litigation